Derealization. When the world looks real but doesn't feel real, derealization is like being locked behind a pane of invisible glass. Everything can be seen clearly: colors, shapes, people, places, but none of it feels like it's really there. The environment doesn't change, but the way it's experienced warps. Streets look normal, but they feel like a set piece. Conversations happen, but it's like watching them on a screen instead of being in them. Everything is just off. This isn't about confusion or hallucination. It's not seeing things that aren't there. It's the loss of connection to what is. People dealing with derealization often say things feel foggy, dreamlike, or hollow. Buildings feel flat. Sound seems delayed or echoey. Colors might look washed out. It's reality with the saturation turned down and the warmth taken out. Most importantly, this state doesn't come from imagination. It's a response. Derealization usually shows up in moments of intense stress, anxiety, exhaustion, or sensory overload. It's a defense mechanism, like the mind pulling back from the present moment to protect itself. Everything gets put at arm's length. Not because someone wants to disconnect, but because the system is overwhelmed and is trying to hit a big red emergency button labeled detach. It can hit during a panic attack after a traumatic experience, or even from prolonged periods of burnout. Sometimes it's short-lived. Other times it lingers, stretching on for days or weeks, making the world feel consistently distant. People might walk through the day doing what they need to do: commute, work, text back. But the emotional and sensory link to all of it feels like it's been severed. There's often a strange tension in derealization, full awareness that something is wrong paired with the inability to fix it instantly. The eyes see clearly, the ears work fine, the body moves normally, but the brain is signaling that the environment isn't safe, or isn't stable, or just isn't real. That conflict between what's perceived and what's felt creates a kind of quiet panic loop that's hard to explain but deeply disorienting. And trying to describe it? Not easy. Saying, "It feels like I'm in a video game," or "everything feels fake," tends to get blank stares. It's not a popular dinner table topic. This makes derealization not just confusing, but also isolating. The experience is inward, private, and difficult to articulate, which only increases the sense of detachment. Derealization often travels with its close cousin, depersonalization. Where derealization is a disconnect from the world, depersonalization is a disconnect from the self. The two can overlap, blend, or switch off. 1 minute, it's the room that doesn't feel real. The next, it's the person in the mirror who feels like a stranger. Despite how surreal it feels, derealization is common, especially among people who deal with anxiety, PTSD, or chronic stress. It's not a sign of psychosis. It doesn't mean someone is losing their grip. It's more like a short circuit in the system, an overworked brain hitting pause on the emotional input, so it can cool off. Recovery from derealization often isn't about fixing something broken. It's about letting the nervous system recalibrate, reducing sensory overload, decreasing background stress, and giving the brain time to reestablish trust in its environment helps the world start to feel solid again. But when it's active, the experience can feel uncanny, like watching someone else live life in one's place. Even though the feeling is unreal, the condition is very real. Derealization strips the world of its immediacy and warmth, but the person inside it is still there, still thinking, still moving through the fog, trying to reconnect. It may not be visible from the outside, but inside, it's a constant attempt to feel grounded in a world that suddenly stopped feeling familiar. It's not a disappearance, it's a waiting room, a temporary blur between presence and distance, a strange echo of reality, waiting to come back into focus. Hypersensitivity. When the volume of life comes pre-installed on high hypersensitivity is the state of being more reactive than average to stimuli, physical, emotional, or both. It's like existing with thinner skin over every sense. Light stings a little brighter, noise cuts a little sharper, and emotions land like bricks instead of feathers. This isn't about fragility, it's about heightened awareness that doesn't come with an off switch. There are two main branches, sensory and emotional. Sensory hypersensitivity refers to increased sensitivity to things like light, sound, touch, or smell. While someone else might not notice the faint buzz of a refrigerator or the flicker of overhead lighting, for a hypersensitive system, those small disturbances can feel invasive. Environments that others describe as normal might feel overwhelming, too loud, too chaotic, or too bright. Then there's emotional hypersensitivity. Here, interactions and feelings carry extra weight. A casual comment might echo for hours. A slight shift in someone's tone of voice can spark a chain of internal questions. Emotional hypersensitivity isn't about being moody. It's about absorbing more detail in a social landscape. Micro-expressions aren't missed. Silence isn't neutral. Everything has a layer, sometimes two. This heightened awareness isn't random. It's often rooted in how the nervous system processes information. Some brains are simply wired to take in more data, subtle sounds, minor mood shifts, background details, and process it more deeply. It's not always pleasant, but it does. Hypersensitive people are often incredibly observant, intuitive, and tuned into details that others overlook entirely. But here's where it gets complicated. That constant stream of information can get overwhelming. Over time, the nervous system doesn't just react, it floods. That's when hypersensitivity tips into overload. The brain, full of sensory data or emotional signals, starts throwing up internal red flags. Everything gets louder inside. Concentration drops. The world becomes too much without ever physically changing. Hypersensitivity often coexists with other traits or conditions. It's frequently found in people who identify as introverted, highly empathetic, or creatively inclined. It's also common in individuals who are neurodivergent, particularly those with autism, ADHD, or sensory processing differences. But it's not exclusive to those groups. Hypersensitivity shows up across all personality types and temperaments, sometimes as a lifelong pattern, other times as a response to trauma or stress. What makes hypersensitivity unique is the sheer depth of processing. It's not just that more is felt, it's that everything goes deeper. A piece of music can cause chills. A poorly chosen word can trigger an emotional landslide. But at the same time, kindness, beauty, and intimacy are experienced just as intensely. That's the trade-off. The system that's sensitive to discomfort is also built to experience the world in striking clarity. In a fast, loud, overstimulated world, hypersensitivity can be both a gift and a challenge. The key isn't to toughen up or get over it, but to understand the settings, knowing what floods the system, what calms it, what triggers emotional spirals. That's how hypersensitivity stops being a constant struggle and starts being something that can be managed, respected, and even appreciated. Because beneath the overwhelm is a powerful radar system, one that feels everything, notices what others miss, and holds the capacity for depth few others ever reach. Not because it wants to, simply because it can. The floater friend isn't an outsider, but they're never quite a fixture either. They exist in the social space between familiar and forgettable. Welcomed in, but not woven in. Not the glue that holds a group together, and not the ghost in the background either. Just present enough to be recognized, just distant enough to be overlooked. This kind of role doesn't usually come from conscious choice. It tends to form over time, shaped by personality, past experiences, and social context. Some people grow into the floater position from childhood, changing schools often, switching environments, or never quite finding their people. Others slip into it quietly during adulthood, when old friendships shift and new ones never fully cement. The result is the same: social proximity without emotional gravity. The floater often blends easily. They're usually easy to be around, pleasant, agreeable, and adaptable. Conversations with them flow effortlessly, but rarely dive deep. They're included in group chats, but not central to them, invited to gatherings, but not the reason for them. They might show up often, but rarely shape the dynamic. This role has advantages. There's a kind of freedom in being unanchored, fewer expectations, less social tension. The floater can move between groups, connect across cliques, navigate awkward situations with ease. They're observers, adaptable to tone and context, often able to slip into most social scenarios without friction. Their neutrality can be a kind of social safety, but float long enough and the drift becomes noticeable. The difference between being included and being chosen starts to stand out. The floater may begin to notice that they're rarely the first. One called rarely the person someone turns to in a moment of crisis or celebration. They're around, but they're not the constant, not the emotional center of any circle. That realization can sting in a quiet, slow-building way. A key feature of the floater role is emotional availability without emotional investment. Floaters are often good listeners, and people may share personal things with them, but the exchange rarely goes both ways. The floater holds space for others, yet their own stories go untold. Not because people are disinterested, but because the dynamic was never built to hold that weight. In many cases, the floater's own behavior reinforces this pattern. They're used to being self-contained, careful with vulnerability, hesitant to burden others. They lean on independence. It's not that connection isn't desired, it's just that deeper engagement often feels unfamiliar or risky. Floaters can be expressive, but not exposed. The emotional tone of this role can shift dramatically depending on context. In one setting, it might feel empowering, a chance to observe without obligation. In another, it might feel isolating, watching. Others bond closely while staying on the outskirts. The same qualities that make the floater a social connector, adaptability, awareness, charm, can also be the very traits that keep them from being fully seen. Many floaters eventually reach a point where the surface isn't enough. They might crave deeper ties, more consistency, more emotional access. But shifting the role isn't instant. Relationships are built on patterns, and patterns resist change. Trying to step into a closer role within a group can feel awkward. There may be hesitation, both from the floater and the people around them, about how to navigate this new layer of connection. That transition, when it happens, often starts quietly. A single conversation that goes deeper. One person who notices the silence behind the smile. A decision to show up more consistently, to ask for something instead of always being the one who's easygoing. It takes time. Emotional presence isn't just about showing up. It's about being seen and allowing others to stay when they do. Still, not every floater wants to anchor. Some are content with their position. They like the space, the low-maintenance ties, the wide net of casual connection. Not everyone is built for the intensity of tight-knit groups. For some, floating is a strategy. For peace, for autonomy, for keeping things light and fluid. But for those who begin to feel the ache of absence, even while surrounded by people, the role can start to wear thin. Being part of everything, but feeling fully part of nothing begins to stand out. That kind of loneliness is unique. It's not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. The floater friend isn't defined by failure to belong. They often belong in many places, but perhaps not fully in any. And that can be both a strength and a sorrow. Recognizing the role is the first step. From there, it's a choice. Continue to drift, or slowly begin the work of anchoring. One person, one moment, one deeper connection at a time, because even someone who moves lightly through social space deserves the chance to land. Fear of being perceived, wanting to disappear and be seen all at once. The fear of being perceived is a paradoxical state, a quiet tug of war between visibility and invisibility. It's the discomfort that flares when attention lands too directly, even when it's benign. Compliments, questions, curious glances, even simple acknowledgement. Suddenly the spotlight feels too bright, even if it's just flickering in someone's peripheral awareness. This isn't just shyness or introversion. It's a deeper anxiety tied to exposure, the feeling that being observed somehow threatens safety, authenticity, or control. Underneath the surface, it's not just the act of being seen that's unsettling, it's the meaning attached to it. What will people think? What are they noticing? What are they assuming? What's being misunderstood? The fear of being perceived often comes with a hyper-awareness of self, not in a confident, centered way, but in a fractured, overly critical one. Every movement feels scrutinized. The sound of one's voice feels alien. Even something like walking into a room can become a choreography of self-monitoring, posture, expression, eye contact, what to do with hands. The body becomes a performance, and presence becomes pressure. This mental state shows up in subtle ways: avoiding eye contact, choosing quiet clothing, opting out of discussions not because of disinterest, but because speaking might invite analysis. Even positive attention, praise, admiration, recognition can feel like too much. Because being noticed isn't just visibility. It opens the door to interpretation, projection, and potentially judgment. Social media magnifies this tension. In online spaces, being perceived isn't just a passing moment. It's archived, rewatched, shared, and commented on. Posts are crafted, deleted, rephrased. A picture uploaded one day might feel unbearably exposed the next. The anxiety doesn't always come from external criticism. It's often internal, driven by how one imagines they're being seen. For some, this fear is rooted in early experiences of being misunderstood, judged, or mocked. Maybe it came from classrooms where speaking up invited teasing, or from households where visibility meant scrutiny, or from social environments where being different, too expressive, too quiet, too anything, was treated like a flaw to be corrected. Over time, the message gets absorbed. It's safer not to be seen too clearly. In some cases, it ties into identity. Individuals navigating queerness, neurodivergence, or marginalized identities often experience this fear not just as social discomfort, but as survival reflex. Being perceived incorrectly or without consent can trigger dysphoria, erasure, or emotional harm. In this context, fear of being perceived is less about vanity or awkwardness. It's a learned caution in a world that doesn't always perceive kindly. At its heart, this fear is about control. Being perceived means being interpreted, and that interpretation isn't always something that can be steered. Once seen, a person becomes a version in someone else's mind. That version might be inaccurate, simplistic, or harsh, and there's no way to correct every misunderstanding. That helplessness can feel unbearable for those who value complexity, authenticity, or privacy. And yet, here's the twist. People who fear being perceived often also crave being known, not performatively, not widely, but intimately, truthfully. The desire for genuine connection runs deep. What's being feared isn't closeness, it's distortion, not interaction, but misrepresentation. The fear isn't rooted in rejection, it's rooted in being seen wrongly. This creates a strange emotional push-pull. There's a longing to be understood, met, mirrored, but also a hesitance to step fully into view. Expressions are filtered, thoughts are softened, presence is edited. The fear of being seen becomes the fear of being misread. So the safest choice often feels like dimming down, staying small, controlling exposure. Over time, this self-minimization can become habitual. People learn to be low-maintenance, background characters, the ones who don't take up too much space. Compliments are deflected, Opinions are withheld, bodies are hidden behind oversized clothes, voices quieted by self-editing. It becomes a practiced invisibility, not from lack of worth, but from fear that being seen fully means being exposed, misunderstood, or unsafe. But perception is inevitable. To exist is to be seen, at least partially. No amount of hiding erases presence. What can change is the framing. Instead of constantly dodging the spotlight, some begin to explore where and with whom visibility feels safe. They find spaces where perception doesn't equal judgment, but understanding. Where being seen is an invitation, not a verdict. The fear doesn't always disappear. It might always flicker in moments of vulnerability. But when perception is met with care, when someone reflects back an image that feels accurate, or at least compassionate, it loosens its grip. Visibility becomes less threatening when it isn't equated with exposure, but with recognition. Fear of being perceived is often misunderstood as insecurity or avoidance, but in reality, it's a finely tuned radar, sensitive to context, interpretation, and history. It's not weakness, it's protection. But even protection can soften in the right conditions. Being seen isn't the same as being judged. And sometimes, it turns out, being perceived by the right eyes in the right light can feel a lot like being understood. Hypersexuality, when desire stops being a spark and becomes a wildfire, hypersexuality is defined by an intense, often overwhelming preoccupation with sexual thoughts, urges, or behaviors. This isn't about having a high libido or enjoying sex frequently. It's about the point where sexuality stops feeling like pleasure and starts feeling like pressure, constant, intrusive, and difficult to manage. It's not always visible from the outside. Hypersexuality doesn't have a set look. It can appear in a variety of forms: frequent hookups, compulsive masturbation, endless scrolling through explicit content, or constant sexual fantasy that interrupts focus and daily routines. In some cases, it's reckless or risky behavior. In others, it's quiet and private, buried under layers of guilt and secrecy. At its core, hypersexuality is rarely just about sex. It often operates more like a coping mechanism, intensity used to drown out something else. Stress, boredom, loneliness, shame, unresolved trauma, any of these can fuel the cycle. The sexual behavior becomes a kind of escape hatch, fast, intense, and momentarily distracting. It feels like relief at first, but eventually it starts looping into something harder to control. There's often a disconnect between the want and the why. The urge might hit out of nowhere, at work, in public, during an emotionally neutral moment. The impulse doesn't always match the context, and that mismatch can create confusion. It's not driven by a clear craving for connection or intimacy. Often it's about regulation, shifting from numbness to stimulation or from pain to momentary pleasure. For some, hypersexuality is episodic, showing up during specific emotional states, after a breakup, during a depressive episode, or in the midst of anxiety. For others, it's more chronic, part of a long-standing pattern. In both cases, the behavior starts to shape the rhythm of the day. Plans are organized around it, energy is drained by it, and over time it stops feeling like a choice. There's also a stigma layer that complicates everything. Society sends mixed messages. Sexual expression is encouraged, even celebrated, in media and marketing. But when sexual behavior crosses into excess or distress, it becomes taboo. People struggling with hypersexuality often don't talk about it. There's a fear of being seen as deviant, broken, or out of control. That silence can isolate, and isolation often fuels the pattern further. Context matters too. Hypersexuality can be part of broader psychological patterns. It shows up in certain mood disorders, most notably in the manic phase of bipolar disorder. It can also follow trauma, especially sexual trauma, where the brain loops back into reenactment or tries to reclaim control through sexual activity. But it also appears in people without diagnoses, individuals who feel trapped in a cycle that's confusing, exhausting, and hard to explain. Importantly, not every case of hypersexual behavior is rooted in pathology. The issue isn't the frequency or form of sex, it's the function. If sexual behavior starts interfering with work, relationships, mental clarity, or physical health, it becomes a red flag. The impact is the key. When desire feels like a demand, when pleasure turns into compulsion, something underneath is usually pulling the strings, there's also the emotional fallout to consider. Shame is common, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed. After the act, instead of feeling satisfied, there's a drop, emptiness, regret. The momentary high fades quickly, replaced with self-criticism or confusion. That emotional whiplash can make it harder to untangle what the original need even was. And yet, despite the distress, breaking the cycle isn't always easy. The pattern builds itself into a daily rhythm, reinforced by the speed and availability of access. Technology makes this even trickier. Content is immediate, interaction is fast. The line between fantasy and action is easier to cross. The more it's repeated, the more ingrained it becomes, not just as a habit, but as a form of emotional regulation. Understanding hypersexuality requires looking beneath the surface behavior. It's not just about impulse, it's about what that impulse is covering. Whether it's an emotional void, a reaction to stress, a search for control, or simply a conditioned routine that's grown beyond what feels healthy. At its most raw, hypersexuality isn't about desire, it's about relief, a fast-acting method of escape in a world that often demands numbness or distraction. But relief without resolution eventually backfires. The behavior soothes nothing long-term. And when it starts to erode self-trust, disrupt relationships, or create emotional instability, the cost becomes hard to ignore. Still, hypersexuality isn't a moral failure or personal weakness. It's a signal, a flare in the system that something's running too hot, too fast, too hard. And like any coping mechanism, it doesn't have to define the person using it. The drive behind it is often very human. The need for stimulation, connection, comfort, control. The challenge is untangling where those needs went unmet and what else might meet them better. Because underneath all the noise and motion, there's usually a quieter question waiting. What's really being reached for, and what might it take to finally feel it without having to escape into the fire to get there? Gift, guilt, gratitude tangled up with discomfort. Gift guilt is the emotional tension that arises when receiving something that's supposed to feel good, presents, favors, compliments, but instead creates a tangle of unease. It's not about disliking the gesture itself. The discomfort comes from what it means, what it implies, or what it seems to demand in return. The core feeling is this: something generous is given, and instead of warmth, there's a tightness in the chest. A thank you is offered, but the smile doesn't quite reach the eyes. The inner voice starts questioning, was this too much? Do I deserve it? How do I repay this? What do I owe now? It can happen with material gifts, surprise items, expensive gestures, thoughtful tokens, or with intangible ones like time, attention, or emotional labor. Compliments can trigger it too. Praise is offered and the recipient flinches a little, unsure how to hold it without feeling awkward or exposed. At the center of gift guilt is imbalance, a sense that something has tipped out of proportion. The person receiving starts to feel like they're in a debt they didn't ask for. Even if no strings were attached, the mind often invents them. Generosity becomes obligation. Kindness becomes a tab to be repaid. This reaction can be shaped by early experiences. People raised in environments where gifts came with hidden costs or were followed by guilt trips, control, or manipulation often learn that receiving isn't safe. A compliment might be bait. A present might come with emotional interest. Over time, even well-intentioned generosity starts to feel dangerous. In other cases, the discomfort comes from internalized beliefs about self-worth. If someone struggles to feel deserving or valuable, any gesture of kindness can feel like a spotlight on that insecurity. The logic becomes warped. If someone gives something, they must be misjudging who I really am. So, the gift doesn't feel like a celebration. It feels like pressure to live up to a version of oneself that doesn't feel accurate. Cultural dynamics also shape this experience. In some communities, modesty is emphasized to the point where accepting praise or generosity can feel like arrogance. Saying thank you can be overridden by the urge to downplay, redirect, or immediately reciprocate. The message is clear. Don't take more than you give, or you risk being seen as selfish, greedy, or soft. Ironically, the person experiencing gift guilt is usually deeply giving themselves. They're often hyper-aware of balance in relationships, careful not to ask for too much or inconvenience others. They say thank you with sincerity. They mean it. But inside, the gesture sits uneasily, like something they need to fix or neutralize. This can lead to a cycle of emotional compensation. After receiving, the guilt kicks in. The person might rush to make it even, sending something back, over-apologizing, minimizing the gift, or deflecting attention. Even something simple like a compliment, "You look nice today," can trigger a response like, "Oh, this old thing?" or "Not really, but thanks." It's less about humility and more about discomfort with being the focus of kindness. At its extreme, gift guilt can start to erode closeness. People might avoid receiving altogether. They'll dodge birthdays, downplay achievements, brush off praise, or avoid letting others help. They'd rather miss out than feel indebted. But over time, this avoidance builds distance. Relationships start to feel one-sided, not because others aren't trying, but because the attempts to give can't land anywhere. On the other side, people who care want to give. It's how connection is built. Denying them that opportunity out of guilt or fear can unintentionally create walls. The refusal to receive doesn't always feel like politeness. Sometimes it feels like rejection. The irony is that giving and receiving aren't opposite energies. They're part of the same cycle. Refusing to receive breaks that rhythm. The most balanced relationships allow space for both. But for those caught in gift guilt, that balance doesn't come easily. The equation always feels uneven, even when it isn't. Working through gift guilt isn't about learning to want more. It's about learning to accept what's already offered. It means recognizing that generosity doesn't always mean transaction. That care can be given freely. That being the recipient of kindness isn't a mistake. It's part of connection. Sometimes generosity isn't about debt. It's about trust. Someone offers something not because they're keeping score, but because they want to invest in a bond, because giving feels good to them, because love, friendship, appreciation, these things are meant to move both ways. Gift guilt doesn't make someone ungrateful. It usually means they're carrying an old weight, one that says receiving is dangerous or undeserved or conditional. But that weight isn't permanent. Over time, it can be put down. Gratitude doesn't have to come with guilt. Sometimes it can just be received and held exactly as it's given. Impostor syndrome success doesn't register when the brain calls it luck. Impostor syndrome is the persistent belief that one's achievements are accidental, undeserved, or temporary. It's a quiet voice, sometimes constant, sometimes triggered, that insists, "You don't really know what you're doing, you just got lucky." Sooner or later, they'll figure it out. It shows up in high performers, quiet creatives, overachievers, and steady workers alike. Despite visible competence or clear results, something internal doesn't align. Praise feels misplaced. Accomplishments come with asterisks. There's always someone else more qualified, more capable, more legitimate. This isn't just humility. It's a disconnect between external validation and internal belief. Compliments bounce off. Achievements are reinterpreted. A job well done becomes, they were being nice. A promotion becomes, they couldn't find anyone else. It's not modesty. It's refusal to integrate success into the self-image. There are different shades to it. Some feel like frauds in new roles, starting a job, entering higher education, publishing work. Others feel it persistently, even after years of steady progress. It might spike before presentations, after feedback, during moments of visibility. Sometimes, even a small mistake will trigger a landslide. See? This proves I'm not supposed to be here. Perfectionists are especially prone. When success is defined as flawlessness, even one error feels disqualifying. The brain doesn't track wins. It searches for gaps, inconsistencies, imperfections. It rewrites the narrative so that every success feels accidental and every flaw feels fatal. Culturally, this experience can be intensified. First-generation students, professionals from marginalized communities, or people breaking into unfamiliar spaces may carry the added weight of representing something. The stakes feel higher, mistakes feel more public, and the internal pressure to prove legitimacy grows heavier. Ironically, imposter syndrome doesn't usually mean someone's unqualified. It often means they're hyper-aware of how much they don't know, and they're assuming everyone else around them isn't doing the same. The perception is that everyone else is operating with full confidence, full competence, full certainty. But in most cases, that's illusion. Everyone is making it up as they go, just at different volumes. What makes imposter syndrome so sticky is that it resists evidence. No matter how many degrees, projects, promotions, or thank yous stack up, the core belief stays intact. It becomes a lens through which everything is filtered. Any failure is internalized, any success is externalized, and yet it's not always visible to others. People with imposter syndrome may seem confident, collected, high-achieving, but internally, every compliment can feel like a ticking time bomb. There's a fear that the spotlight will eventually expose the truth, that they're underqualified or faking it, or just really good at looking like they belong. Some respond by overcompensating, working longer hours, triple-checking everything, avoiding risk. Others go quiet, turn down opportunities, stay in the background. It's not about laziness or arrogance. It's about fear of being seen too clearly. But here's the twist. Imposter syndrome isn't proof of failure. It's usually evidence of growth. It tends to show up most when someone is expanding into new roles, new challenges, new spaces. The discomfort doesn't mean someone doesn't belong. It means they're in motion, they're learning, they're stepping beyond what's familiar, and in that gap between familiarity and mastery, the brain defaults to self-doubt. Imposter syndrome may never disappear entirely. It often lingers in high-functioning people, but it doesn't have to dominate. Sometimes the goal isn't to erase the voice, it's to recognize it without obeying it, to say, "I hear you," and keep going anyway, because the real fraud isn't the person who doubts their success. It's the voice that insists they don't deserve to be here even after all the work it took to arrive. Emotional parentification, when the child becomes the caretaker. Emotional parentification is a role reversal that happens quietly, often without intention. It's when a child takes on the emotional responsibilities of a parent, soothing them, supporting them, managing their moods, long before they've developed the tools to understand their own. In these dynamics, the parent may lean on the child for emotional regulation. The child becomes the listener, the consoler, the problem solver. They learn to sense shifts in tone, track emotional patterns, anticipate needs. The home becomes less a place of guidance and more a place where they are always on alert, always us, translating the adult world into something manageable. The language may be subtle. You're the only one I can talk to. You understand me better than anyone. I don't know what I'd do without you. On the surface, it sounds like closeness, but underneath, it creates pressure. The child begins to absorb not just the feelings, but the responsibility for those feelings. They become the container for someone else's unresolved pain. This isn't always dramatic or abusive. It can happen in homes that look stable from the outside. A single parent venting a little too often, a parent with mental health struggles, addiction, or untreated trauma, or simply a family where emotional boundaries were never clearly drawn. The result is the same. The child starts to adapt, to overfunction, to carry weight that isn't theirs, and they get good at it. Hyper-attuned, emotionally agile, wise beyond their years. But that wisdom comes at a cost. Their own feelings get buried, their own needs get minimized. They learn that love means labor, that closeness requires caretaking, that safety depends on staying useful. This kind of early conditioning doesn't just stay in childhood. It follows people into adulthood in subtle and persistent ways. Relationships become one-sided. Emotional availability turns into emotional exhaustion. Asking for help feels wrong. Vulnerability feels risky. Being needed feels safer than being known. People who experienced emotional parentification often struggle to identify what they actually want. They're skilled at reading others, meeting needs, calming storms. But when it comes to their own desires or pain, there's a blank space. The habit of self-erasure becomes second nature. There's also guilt. Guilt for setting boundaries. Guilt for saying no. Guilt for feeling tired. Because somewhere deep down, the message was internalized. Care is not something to receive, only something to provide. If they stop performing that role, they fear being abandoned, rejected, or replaced. The paradox is that they may be surrounded by people who care about them, but the wiring doesn't allow that care to land. Compliments are deflected, support feels foreign, rest feels undeserved. They keep giving even when empty, because slowing down threatens the identity that's always been tied to being strong, capable, and emotionally available. Emotional parentification is not about blame, it's about structure. When a system places a child in the role of emotional manager, it distorts development. It teaches love through labor, it teaches connection through sacrifice. And it can take years to unlearn, but it can be unlearned. Reconnection begins when the pattern is seen clearly, when the impulse to fix or soothe is paused, when feelings, messy, inconvenient, unfiltered, are allowed to exist without justification. When care is allowed to flow back, not just outward. Healing doesn't mean abandoning everyone. It means stepping out of a role that was never meant to be permanent. It means allowing relationships to become mutual. It means remembering that the child who held everything together deserved to be held too. Emotional parentification doesn't define a person forever, but understanding its shape explains a lot. The fatigue, the hyper-responsibility, the invisible pressure to stay needed. And with that understanding comes space. Space to be something more than strong. Space to be human. Space to rest. Emotional parentification, when the child becomes the caretaker. Emotional parentification is a role reversal that happens quietly, often without intention. It's when a child takes on the emotional responsibilities of a parent, soothing them, supporting them, managing their moods, long before they've developed the tools to understand their own. In these dynamics, the parent may lean on the child for emotional regulation. The child becomes the listener, the consoler, the problem solver. They learn to sense shifts in tone, track emotional patterns, anticipate needs. The home becomes less a place of guidance and more a place where they are always on alert, always us, translating the adult world into something manageable. The language may be subtle. You're the only one I can talk to. You understand me better than anyone. I don't know what I'd do without you. On the surface, it sounds like closeness, but underneath, it creates pressure. The child begins to absorb not just the feelings, but the responsibility for those feelings. They become the container for someone else's unresolved pain. This isn't always dramatic or abusive. It can happen in homes that look stable from the outside. A single parent venting a little too often, a parent with mental health struggles, addiction, or untreated trauma, or simply a family where emotional boundaries were never clearly drawn. The result is the same. The child starts to adapt, to overfunction, to carry weight that isn't theirs, and they get good at it. Hyper-attuned, emotionally agile, wise beyond their years. But that wisdom comes at a cost. Their own feelings get buried, their own needs get minimized. They learn that love means labor, that closeness requires caretaking, that safety depends on staying useful. This kind of early conditioning doesn't just stay in childhood. It follows people into adulthood in subtle and persistent ways. Relationships become one-sided. Emotional availability turns into emotional exhaustion. Asking for help feels wrong. Vulnerability feels risky. Being needed feels safer than being known. People who experienced emotional parentification often struggle to identify what they actually want. They're skilled at reading others, meeting needs, calming storms. But when it comes to their own desires or pain, there's a blank space. The habit of self-erasure becomes second nature. There's also guilt. Guilt for setting boundaries. Guilt for saying no. Guilt for feeling tired. Because somewhere deep down, the message was internalized. Care is not something to receive, only something to provide. If they stop performing that role, they fear being abandoned, rejected, or replaced. The paradox is that they may be surrounded by people who care about them, but the wiring doesn't allow that care to land. Compliments are deflected, support feels foreign, rest feels undeserved. They keep giving even when empty, because slowing down threatens the identity that's always been tied to being strong, capable, and emotionally available. Emotional parentification is not about blame. It's about structure. When a system places a child in the role of emotional manager, it distorts development. It teaches love through labor. It teaches connection through sacrifice. And it can take years to unlearn, but it can be unlearned. Reconnection begins when the pattern is seen clearly, when the impulse to fix or soothe is paused, when feelings, messy, inconvenient, unfiltered, are allowed to exist without justification. When care is allowed to flow back, not just outward. Healing doesn't mean abandoning everyone. It means stepping out of a role that was never meant to be permanent. It means allowing relationships to become mutual. It means remembering that the child who held everything together deserved to be held too. Emotional parentification doesn't define a person forever, but understanding its shape explains a lot. The fatigue, the hyper-responsibility, the invisible pressure to stay needed. And with that understanding comes space. Space to be something more than strong. Space to be human. Space to rest. Chronic indecisiveness. When choosing feels heavier than doing, chronic indecisiveness isn't about being flaky or slow. It's about experiencing decision-making as a mental gridlock, where even small choices carry an exaggerated sense of consequence. The pressure isn't always tied to the outcome. It's the act of choosing itself that becomes overwhelming. It can show up in everyday places, picking something to eat, choosing an outfit, deciding what message to send or when. Things that take others seconds can take minutes or hours, or be avoided altogether. The longer the delay, the heavier the choice begins to feel. Eventually, the indecision starts to feel like a decision in itself. The mind becomes a battleground of pros and cons, endless weighing of outcomes, and second-guessing before anything even happens. Sometimes there's a desire to make the perfect choice. Other times, there's a fear of making the wrong one. And in the middle, there's often a quiet fear of regret, of choosing something that can't be undone, even if the choice is trivial. This kind of indecisiveness often has deeper roots. It may come from environments where mistakes were punished, harshly or unpredictably, where outcomes carried weight beyond reason, or where there was little room for trial and error, and every step felt monitored. Over time, the message becomes clear. Be careful, because getting it wrong costs too much. Perfectionism plays a role too. When the standard is flawless, anything short of that feels like failure. So the brain doesn't choose, it stalls, it loops, it spirals, not out of laziness or indifference, but out of pressure. The more important the decision feels, the less safe it becomes to make. And yet, chronic indecisiveness isn't limited to big moments. It can drain energy through constant mental friction. 100 tiny pauses throughout the day. Should I? Go or stay? Speak or stay quiet? Send the message or wait? It becomes a form of background noise that wears down confidence and momentum. Some cope by outsourcing decisions, asking others, waiting for signs, hoping for outside confirmation. Others default to avoidance, delaying, distracting, or settling for the path of least resistance. But even then, the question doesn't go away. It lingers in the background unresolved. The emotional toll is subtle but steady. Chronic indecisiveness can lead to self-doubt, frustration, even shame. There's often a narrative that forms, "I'm bad at decisions," or "I can't trust myself." That belief becomes its own trap, reinforcing the hesitation with each new choice. And ironically, the indecisiveness can coexist with high intelligence or strong intuition. It's not about lack of capacity, it's about internal interference. The mind is fully capable, but the noise of what-ifs and imagined outcomes hijacks the process before clarity can land. This indecision also steals time, hours spent circling the same question, days lost to delayed moves. Sometimes the fear of making a wrong turn ends up costing more than the wrong turn ever would have. And that's the part that rarely gets noticed. Indecisiveness doesn't protect from mistakes. It just replaces one kind of discomfort with another. But even though it feels stuck, chronic indecisiveness doesn't mean someone is broken. It means the mind is scanning for safety, trying to predict pain, trying to minimize regret. Underneath the freeze is often a person who deeply cares about the outcome, about others, about doing the right thing. And sometimes the shift doesn't come from finding the right choice. It comes from learning that not all choices need to be right. Some can just be good enough. Some are experiments. Some are pivots. Some will lead to mistakes, and that's part of the design. Because life isn't built on perfect decisions. It's built on movement, on course corrections, on learning through motion. Chronic indecision slows that process, but it doesn't have to stop it. Even hesitation is a signal. It means there's thoughtfulness, awareness, care. But at some point, thinking has to give way to doing, even if the doing feels imperfect. Some paths are only visible in hindsight, and some clarity only arrives after the choice is made. Emotional numbness, feeling nothing in a world that demands feeling everything. Emotional numbness is a state where feelings seem to vanish, not selectively, entirely. Joy doesn't register. Sadness is muted. Excitement falls flat. Pain is distant. Life continues in motion, but internally everything feels paused, blank, detached. It's not always dramatic. It doesn't necessarily look like despair. Often, it looks like functionality. Tasks get done. Conversations happen. Smiles might even appear. But it all feels strangely hollow, like going through the motions of being a person without actually feeling like one. This numbness isn't the absence of emotion so much as the absence of access to it. The feelings may still exist, but they're buried under layers of exhaustion, stress, trauma, or mental overload. It's the brain pulling. The emergency brake when too much has been felt for too long. People often describe it as feeling like a ghost in their own life, disconnected from themselves and the world around them. Food doesn't taste like anything. Music doesn't stir anything. Days blur together. Conversations feel like acting. There's no obvious sadness, just a kind of emotional silence. It's not limited to any one experience. Emotional numbness can follow trauma, depression, anxiety, burnout, or prolonged periods of emotional survival. It's the system going offline to protect itself from further overwhelm. A form of shutdown that says, no more, not now. Sometimes it appears after a single high-impact event. Other times it builds slowly, weeks, months, or even years, of holding too much until the emotional system simply stops processing. The weight doesn't go away. It just stops being felt in real time. What makes emotional numbness especially frustrating is its invisibility. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. There is no visible injury, no outburst, no collapse, just stillness. But internally, it can feel like watching life through soundproof glass. Things are happening, but they don't land. People in this state often try to snap out of it, willing themselves to feel something, anything. They seek out emotional stimuli, movies, music, old memories, people, but the reactions are delayed if they show up at all. It's not a lack of desire. It's a lack of emotional conductivity. There's also guilt. Guilt for not reacting normally. Guilt for not feeling love in the moments it's expected. Guilt for being untouched by things that once mattered. The mind says, you should feel something. The body says nothing. This disconnect can create confusion in relationships. Loved ones don't understand why affection feels distant, why engagement has dropped, why the spark is missing. But the person who's numb isn't withdrawing out of apathy. They're stuck in a neutral state they can't easily reverse. And ironically, emotional numbness doesn't mean someone is emotionally shallow. It often means they've felt too much, that their system is in self-preservation mode, that the feelings are there, just buried, waiting for the signal that it's safe to return. Recovery from this state doesn't always come from force or intensity. It usually begins in quiet ways, small routines, soft reintroductions to the present moment, experiences without pressure to react a certain way. Time and consistency tend to matter more than breakthroughs. And sometimes, numbness lifts gradually. A small laugh hits differently. A song stirs a memory. A moment of anger, relief, or tenderness breaks through. Not all at once, but like a frozen surface starting to thaw piece by piece. Emotional numbness isn't apathy, it's exhaustion. In disguise, it's the mind hitting pause until it feels safe enough to press play again. Maladaptive daydreaming, when imagination becomes a second life. Maladaptive daydreaming is not the casual drift of thought that happens in a boring meeting or during a quiet commute. It's not the occasional fantasy about a better job, a romantic crush, or a what-if scenario. It's an immersive, time-consuming mental world that pulls harder than reality itself. It's not an escape, it's an alternate life, so vivid and emotionally intense that it starts to feel more real than the one being lived. People with maladaptive daydreaming often create detailed, evolving stories in their minds. These aren't fleeting thoughts. They're whole narratives with characters, dialogue, backstory, emotional arcs. Sometimes the daydreamer is a central character. Sometimes they observe like a director. Either way, these inner stories carry weight. They're rehearsed, revisited, expanded. They become places to go, not just thoughts to have. This behavior isn't lazy or indulgent. It usually starts as a coping mechanism, a way to feel joy when reality lacks it, a way to feel power when life feels powerless, a way to feel connection, love, excitement, identity, especially if those things are absent in real life. The fantasy fills in the emotional gaps, builds a world where needs are met without risk or rejection. What separates maladaptive daydreaming from typical imagination is intensity, frequency, and impact. It can take up hours a day. It often involves pacing, music, repetitive motion, or rituals that help the mind sink deeper into the fantasy. Some people lose sleep over it. Others fall behind on responsibilities, relationships, or goals. Reality becomes muted. Time disappears, and yet the experience itself is often pleasurable. The inner world becomes a sanctuary. There's control, creativity, satisfaction. Real life feels gray by comparison. The result is a push-pull, craving the daydreams, then feeling guilty for the time lost in them. Wanting to stay, needing to return, not knowing how to fully do either. Over time, the habit becomes compulsive. The brain defaults to fantasy during boredom, stress, or silence. Even moments of potential connection are filtered through a desire to return inward. People may find it easier to imagine social interaction than to risk real vulnerability. Easier to fantasize about success than to attempt something that might fail. This isn't because they're disconnected from reality. It's because reality hasn't felt safe, rewarding, or responsive. In many cases, maladaptive daydreamers have histories of emotional neglect, trauma, or isolation. When the outside world felt cold, the mind created warmth. When reality felt uncontrollable, fantasy offered structure. But that warmth eventually traps, because the time spent daydreaming rarely translates to progress outside of it. Dreams grow, but plans stall. Emotional needs are met internally, so they're never voiced aloud. The longer it continues, the harder it becomes to come back fully, to invest in real relationships, take real risks, make real decisions. This doesn't mean imagination is the enemy. The mind's ability to create rich internal worlds is a gift. Many maladaptive daydreamers are incredibly creative: writers, artists, storytellers, visionaries. The problem isn't the dreaming, it's the isolation, the imbalance between the inner world and the outer one, the absence of bridges between the two. Recovery doesn't mean shutting off imagination. It means reintegrating it, bringing pieces of the dream into reality, writing the stories down, turning ideas into art, having the conversation the fantasy rehearsed 100 times, letting the emotional truth of the dream guide what's missing in the real world, and then going to find it. It also means learning to tolerate the imperfection of reality. Fantasy is clean, predictable, safe. Real life is messy and slow. But it's the only place where connection actually lands, where progress actually counts, where the self actually grows. Maladaptive daydreaming isn't childish. It's a brilliant, adaptive, deeply human response to a world that didn't offer enough. But eventually, that second life begins to take the place of the first. And the way forward isn't to abandon imagination. It's to invite it into the present and use it to build something real. Perfectionism, paralysis. When doing nothing feels safer than doing it wrong. Perfectionism, paralysis is the mental freeze that sets in when the standards are so high, nothing feels good enough to start. It's not laziness, it's not procrastination, in the casual sense. It's the deep-rooted belief that unless something can be done perfectly, it shouldn't be done at all. The idea of just do your best doesn't register here, because the inner voice says, if it's not flawless, it's a failure. So the brain stalls, the hands hesitate, the plan stays untouched. And the longer things stay in that state, the heavier they feel. What could have been a simple task becomes a mountain of pressure. Perfectionism, paralysis doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like staring at a blank document for hours, or rewriting the same sentence 10 times, or researching a project endlessly but never actually starting it. It's the illusion of effort with none of the progress. And behind that delay is fear. Fear of judgment, rejection, or even self-disappointment. It often starts with ambition, a desire to do things well. But over time, that healthy drive twists into something rigid. The standards climb, the self-talk hardens, and what once felt inspiring now feels suffocating. The goal isn't progress anymore, it's flawlessness. And flawlessness, by definition, is unreachable. This paralysis doesn't always come from self-pressure alone. It can be learned. Environments that emphasized achievement over effort, outcomes over process, or criticism over encouragement can instill the message early. Mistakes aren't allowed. Only perfection earns approval, and ironically, People who struggle with perfectionism, paralysis are often high-capacity individuals, smart, creative, detail-oriented. But that same sharpness becomes a trap. They see every possible flaw in advance, every way something could go wrong, every version that isn't quite right. The awareness becomes paralyzing. Small tasks become impossible to begin. Big dreams stay locked in the mind, untouched. And over time, the silence becomes louder. The ideas pile up, the goals fade, and the identity shifts. The person who once had ambition starts to believe they're just someone who can't follow through. But the issue was never ability. It was never intelligence. It was pressure, and the way that pressure distorted the process. When the expectation is perfection, even trying feels dangerous. Every attempt becomes a test of worth, and that's too much to carry every time the cursor blinks. The cost isn't just missed deadlines, it's lost confidence, creative fatigue, emotional burnout. Because the brain is constantly on edge, preparing for a performance that never begins. And the longer the paralysis lasts, the harder it becomes to believe anything can be done differently. But perfectionism, paralysis doesn't mean someone is incapable. It means their standards have outgrown their self-trust. And the way out isn't to lower the bar, it's to shift the goal. From perfect to done, from flawless to finished, from being the best to being present. Progress is messy. Drafts are ugly. Learning curves are steep. But movement matters more than polish. The first version will never be perfect. And it's not supposed to be. Because perfection is a mirage. It moves every time the finish line gets close. The real skill isn't in doing things perfectly. It's in doing things anyway, and letting the work be seen even when it still has rough edges. Rumination, overthinking. When the mind won't stop replaying what's already done. Rumination is the mental loop that replays thoughts over and over without resolution. It's not reflection. It's not problem-solving. It's thinking stuck. On repeat, going back to the same memory, conversation, mistake, or hypothetical scenario like a song, skipping in the background. It usually starts with a trigger, a small embarrassment, a questionable decision, something that didn't go quite right. The mind latches on and doesn't let go. The moment keeps replaying, not to gain insight, but because the brain is looking for some kind of closure it can't seem to find. There's often a feeling of, if I just think about this one more time, maybe I'll figure it out. But rumination rarely leads to clarity. It leads to exhaustion. The thoughts go in circles. One worry branches into 5 more. Questions multiply. Scenarios stretch out into the worst possible versions of themselves. This kind of overthinking can cover anything: social interactions, work mistakes, relationship issues, or imagined futures. And the voice inside isn't kind. It's sharp, analytical, and relentless. It points out every flaw, rewinds every sentence, challenges every decision. It doesn't just review the past, it interrogates it. Rumination can feel productive because it looks like effort. It feels like the brain is working hard. But underneath, it's usually just anxiety dressed up as preparation. What if this happens? What did they really mean? Should I have said that differently? The questions keep coming, but the answers don't land. This mental pattern often shows up in people with high self-awareness and emotional sensitivity. People who want to understand their actions, protect their relationships, and avoid making mistakes. But rumination doesn't offer protection. It drains mental energy and makes the present feel unsafe. There's a big difference between thinking something through and thinking something to death. Healthy reflection has a timeline. It ends with understanding or action. Rumination just drags things out. The longer it goes on, the more it distorts the original situation, until the memory feels worse than the moment ever was. It can also affect how the future is approached. After enough time spent dissecting the past, the mind starts preloading anxiety into what hasn't even happened yet. This can lead to decision paralysis, avoidance, or constantly editing oneself in real time to avoid creating new things to ruminate about later, and it doesn't always show outwardly. People can appear calm, functional, engaged, while their mental space is filled with replayed moments and imagined arguments. It's not dramatic, but it's draining. Sleep gets interrupted. Conversations lose their clarity, focus disappears. The inner noise gets louder than the actual world. Rumination isn't a sign of being broken. It's a sign that the brain is trying to make sense of something, but it's doing it with no exit strategy. The mind wants resolution, but keeps using the same track to find it. The shift comes from recognizing when thinking stops helping, when it's no longer insight, but inertia, when the effort isn't building clarity, but eroding peace. Thoughts don't always need to be solved. Some just need to be released. Not because they don't matter, but because holding onto them is costing more than they're worth. Enmeshment, boundary issues. When closeness erases the line between self and other, enmeshment happens when the boundaries between people, especially in families or close relationships, become so blurred that individual identities get lost. Thoughts, feelings, needs, and even decisions begin to feel shared, not by mutual understanding, but by default. The line between me and you stops being clear. It's not always loud or controlling. Sometimes it looks like intense loyalty, emotional closeness, or strong family values. But underneath, there's a subtle expectation. Feel what I feel, believe what I believe, prioritize what I need. And when someone tries to pull away or assert independence, it's treated as betrayal rather than growth. Enmeshment often forms in relationships that are emotionally intense but structurally unbalanced. A parent leans on a child for emotional support. A partner treats disagreement like abandonment. A family teaches that love means constant involvement, with little room for separation. The message is simple, even if unspoken. Closeness is everything, and distance is dangerous. In enmeshed dynamics, one person's mood can become everyone's responsibility. If someone's upset, others rush to fix it. If someone's making a choice, it has to be run through the emotional filter of everyone around them. Guilt becomes a tool. Silence becomes a signal. Everyone is expected to move together, even when it's at the expense of individual needs. People raised in enmeshed environments often become hyper-aware of others' emotions. They learn to read tone, body language, and subtext before they even understand their own reactions. Their emotional radar becomes overdeveloped, not out of empathy alone, but because peace depends on constant management of someone else's internal world. This creates long-term confusion about autonomy. What do I actually want? Do I really believe this, or was it just absorbed? If someone else is unhappy, is it automatically my job to fix it? These questions don't always have immediate answers, because when selfhood has always been merged with others, standing alone doesn't just feel unfamiliar. It feels wrong. Enmeshment can also show up as guilt for doing well. If independence threatens the emotional balance, success might be followed by shame. Making a choice without checking in might feel selfish. Setting boundaries might be seen as cold. The pull to stay connected at any cost can override even the most basic needs for space or differentiation, and yet enmeshment is often confused with love, especially when it's framed as closeness or loyalty. But real closeness allows for space. Real loyalty includes respect for boundaries. Love shouldn't require shrinking or merging. It should make room for both connection and autonomy. People in enmeshed dynamics aren't trying to manipulate or control most of the time. They're repeating patterns where safety is tied to sameness, and fear arises the moment someone steps outside the emotional script. But patterns can be rewritten, starting with the recognition that being separate doesn't mean being distant, and being close doesn't require being identical. The process of untangling enmeshment is slow. It's not about cutting people off, it's about defining where one person ends and another begins. It's about learning to feel discomfort without guilt, to say no without fearing collapse, and to reclaim the parts of the self that were surrendered for peace. Because connection isn't measured by how much is shared, it's measured by how much is allowed to be different while still being held with care. Avoidant attachment, when closeness feels like a threat instead of a comfort. Avoidant attachment is a relational pattern built on distance, both emotional and physical. It's not that connection is unwanted, it's that connection feels unsafe, inconsistent, or too demanding. So the instinct is to pull back, keep space, and stay in control. People with avoidant attachment often appear independent, self-sufficient, low drama. They may value privacy, protect their routines, and keep emotions under wraps. They're usually not the ones texting first, opening up easily, or asking for help, not because they don't care, but because closeness tends to activate a quiet alarm. This could go wrong. At the core of avoidant attachment is a belief, often unconscious, that needing others is risky. That vulnerability leads to disappointment, that the more someone gets close, the more power they have to hurt or disrupt. So distance becomes a form of safety, not necessarily isolation, but regulation, a way to stay involved without becoming emotionally dependent. This attachment style often forms early. In environments where emotional needs were dismissed, discouraged, or inconsistently met, a child learns to turn inward. If expressing sadness or asking for comfort led to rejection or discomfort, the brain adapts. The safest strategy becomes, don't need too much, don't feel too deeply, handle it alone. In adulthood, this shows up in subtle ways. Long silences in conversations where emotions are expected, a tendency to shut down during conflict, feeling overwhelmed by intimacy even when it's wanted. People with avoidant attachment may crave connection, but the moment it starts to feel real, the impulse to retreat kicks in. There is often a strong preference for logic over emotion, for problem solving instead of processing. When a partner says, "I need closeness," the avoidant response might be confusion, defensiveness, or withdrawal. Not out of coldness, but because those needs feel foreign, like something written in a language that was never taught. Relationships with avoidant individuals can be confusing for both sides. Partners may feel shut out, left guessing, or constantly reaching for connection that doesn't land. Meanwhile, the avoidant person may feel pressured, suffocated, or misunderstood, longing for connection, but bracing for the cost. There's often internal conflict, wanting to be known but fearing exposure, wanting support but distrusting dependence, wanting love but struggling with its intensity. So instead of expressing needs, they might minimize them. Instead of leaning in, they stay just far enough, a way to feel in control. This doesn't mean people with avoidant attachment are cold or incapable of love. In fact, they often feel deeply, but those feelings stay under the surface, managed privately. The discomfort isn't with love itself, it's with what love demands: openness, flexibility, and a tolerance for emotional risk. The challenge is in learning that connection doesn't have to equal loss of self, that being close doesn't mean being consumed, that intimacy doesn't have to come at the cost of safety. It can coexist with autonomy, with space, with individuality. Avoidant attachment isn't fixed. It's a learned response, one that made sense once but may not serve forever. And unlearning it starts with small movements, naming discomfort, staying present during emotional moments, letting others in a little more than feels comfortable. Because love doesn't have to mean surrender. Sometimes it simply means staying, even when the instinct says to run. Savior complex, when helping turns into a hidden need to be needed. The savior complex is the compulsion to fix, rescue, or carry others, often at the expense of personal boundaries, energy, or emotional balance. On the surface, it looks like generosity, supportiveness, being the strong one. But underneath, there's often an unspoken contract. I'll help you, and in return, I'll feel worthy. It's not always dramatic. The savior complex can be quiet, polite, even noble. It might show up as always being the one people come to with problems, being the mediator in every conflict, offering advice before it's asked for, volunteering emotional labor when there's already nothing left in the tank. The helper role becomes a default setting, not an occasional act. At its core, the savior complex isn't just about helping. It's about identity. Helping becomes tied to self-worth. If others are okay because of something that was done or given, that becomes proof of value. It creates a sense of importance, control, and affirmation. But it also becomes a trap. People with a savior complex often attract those who are struggling, lost, or emotionally unstable. Sometimes it's out of compassion, sometimes it's out of habit, sometimes it's because chaos feels familiar. Whatever. The reason, the savior steps in, not just to assist, but to carry. The problem is, being the savior often means operating on uneven ground, giving more than receiving, fixing things that aren't theirs to fix, taking responsibility for other people's healing, growth, or peace. It creates a dynamic where one person holds the emotional weight for two and slowly starts to disappear in the process. This pattern can stem from early experiences. Maybe caretaking was learned young, soothing a parent, managing conflict, making sure everything was okay. The message becomes internalized. Love is earned through usefulness. Worth comes from sacrifice. Being needed is the safest form of being wanted. And at first, it works. People rely on the savior, praise them, depend on them. But over time, resentment builds, both ways. The savior feels drained, underappreciated, and unseen beyond their utility. The people being helped may feel smothered, disempowered, or emotionally indebted. What started as care quietly turns into control. The savior complex isn't about bad intentions. It's often rooted in genuine empathy. But it turns toxic when someone else's healing becomes a personal mission, and their pain becomes a source of identity. It's not wrong to help, but when helping becomes a way to avoid one's own emptiness, it stops being kindness and starts being compensation. Letting go of the savior role can feel terrifying. Who am I if I'm not fixing? What happens when I stop being the one others lean on? There's fear that stepping back means becoming invisible. But the truth is, the most honest relationships are built on mutual support, not one-sided salvation. Healing the savior complex doesn't mean abandoning others. It means stepping out of the belief that carrying everyone else is the only way to be worthy. It means allowing others to be responsible for their own lives. It means choosing presence over control, support over sacrifice, connection over rescue, because being needed isn't the same as being loved, and love doesn't require saving. It requires staying human together. Emotional burnout. When feeling becomes a full-time job, emotional burnout isn't just exhaustion, it's depletion. It's the slow erosion of emotional capacity over time until there's nothing left to give, and even basic reactions feel out of reach. Smiles feel forced. Patience is thin. Empathy, which once came naturally, now takes effort. The system isn't just tired, it's dry. Unlike physical burnout, which might come from long hours or lack of sleep, emotional burnout builds from sustained emotional labor, constant caretaking, suppressing feelings, being the strong one, managing others' needs, moods, or expectations while quietly neglecting one's own. It's not loud or explosive. It's quiet, constant, and cumulative. Often, the signs are subtle at first. Irritability where there used to be compassion. Detachment where there used to be warmth. Tasks that require emotional energy, conversations, interactions, even showing up, begin to feel overwhelming. It's not that things suddenly became harder. It's that the inner reserves have been running on empty for too long. This kind of burnout is especially common in roles that demand emotional presence: caregiving, teaching, social work, customer service, parenting. But it also appears in personal relationships, being the emotional anchor in a friend group, the peacemaker in a family, the one who holds everything together when no one else can. The emotional load isn't always visible to others. The person burning out may still be showing up, responding, doing what's expected. But internally, it's all weight, no recovery, just one more thing to feel, manage, contain. Over time, emotional expression gets replaced with emotional autopilot. Everything starts to feel flat. Rest doesn't always help either. Not because it isn't needed, but because burnout isn't fixed by sleep alone. The issue isn't just fatigue, it's emotional overload without balance. Even during downtime, the mind might keep running, replaying conversations, anticipating future needs, feeling guilty for doing nothing. Rest becomes just another item on the to-do list. One of the most disorienting parts of emotional burnout is the numbness that follows. The emotions don't just shrink, they vanish. Joy, sadness, inspiration, connection, gone or dulled. It becomes difficult to care, to react, to feel anything deeply. And when nothing feels like it matters, motivation disappears too. Burnout often brings guilt along for the ride. Guilt for not being able to keep up. Guilt for not being as present, supportive, or engaged as before. Guilt for resenting people or roles that were once embraced. But the truth is, emotional burnout isn't failure, it's feedback. It's the system saying, this has been too much, for too long, with too little in return. The solution isn't to push through. It's to pause and take inventory. What's draining energy? What's giving it back? Where are the imbalances? What boundaries have slipped or were never there to begin with? Recovery starts with subtraction before addition, less emotional, multitasking, less over-explaining, less being available at all times. It may feel unnatural, even selfish, but healing requires space and permission to stop being the emotional engine for everyone else. Because emotional burnout doesn't just steal energy, it steals connection to others, to life, to self. Getting that back takes time. And more than anything, it takes the belief that emotions aren't resources to be spent until they're gone. They're signals. They're meant to move. They need rest, too. Burnout is not weakness. It's a boundary crossed too many times. And healing begins when that boundary is finally redrawn. Fawn response, people-pleasing, when safety comes from staying agreeable. The fawn response is a survival instinct, less known than fight, flight, or freeze, but just as powerful. It's the reflex to appease, to comply, to over-accommodate, especially in situations that feel tense, unpredictable, or unsafe. It's not just kindness, it's not politeness, it's a strategy built from experience. If everyone else is okay, maybe nothing bad will happen. This response often develops in environments where conflict felt dangerous, where expressing needs led to punishment, or where being invisible was the safest option. Instead of confronting or avoiding a threat, the mind adapts by becoming whatever the situation seems to require. It learns how to de-escalate, how to soothe, how to become small. Enough not to provoke anything. The fawn response tends to look like people-pleasing, saying yes when it should be no, avoiding disagreement, smiling through discomfort, over-apologizing, offering help before being asked. At first, it might be mistaken for warmth or selflessness, but underneath is often a nervous system that equates approval with survival. The fawn response isn't about liking everyone or wanting to be liked. It's about reducing perceived threat, emotional threat, relational threat, rejection, disapproval, abandonment. The mind detects tension and moves to neutralize it, even at personal cost. People who fawn tend to be highly intuitive. They pick up on moods fast. They adjust their tone, their words, even their body language to keep others comfortable. But this constant shape-shifting leads to exhaustion and eventually to disconnection from the self. Over time, it becomes hard to know what preferences, needs, or opinions actually belong to them, and which ones were simply absorbed to keep the peace. The long-term effects often include resentment, burnout, and a sense of being invisible. Even when surrounded by people, there can be a loneliness to constantly performing agreeableness. Relationships feel one-sided, boundaries get blurry, and when the urge to finally say no does surface, it's usually buried in guilt. What makes the fawn response tricky is that it's rewarded. Being accommodating is socially praised. It keeps situations smooth. It makes people comfortable. But when that behavior comes from fear instead of choice, it's no longer generosity. It's survival mode, dressed as selflessness. Unlearning the fawn response means giving the self permission to take up space again, to disappoint, to disagree, to risk not being liked in exchange for being real. It starts small, pausing before agreeing, checking in before reacting, choosing honesty over habit, because peace isn't real if it always costs your presence. And love that depends on disappearing isn't love worth keeping. Egoism, fear of being narcissistic, when shrinking feels safer than standing out. Egoism is a subtle but powerful mental pattern defined by the chronic shrinking of one's own presence in order to avoid being perceived as narcissistic, self-centered, or emotionally demanding. It's a pattern that often grows in the shadow of narcissism, whether from a parent, a partner, or a culture that discourages emotional needs. At the surface, it can look like modesty, humility, or being low maintenance. Egoists are often known for being great listeners, agreeable, and emotionally contained. But behind the calm exterior is often a person who has learned that being too much leads to disapproval, rejection, or emotional harm. So they dim themselves, quietly, consistently. The term comes from the myth of Echo, a nymph cursed to only repeat the words of others, unable to speak her own truth. In psychological terms, egoism describes someone who fears taking up emotional space. Compliments are brushed off. Praise feels undeserved. Asking for help is deeply uncomfortable. Expressing pain feels like an intrusion. This response is often rooted in early experiences. In childhood, if a caregiver was emotionally volatile, narcissistic, or dismissive, a child might learn to stay small. Keeping needs minimal becomes a way to maintain peace. The belief forms. If I don't ask for much, I'll be safe. Over time, this adapts into a full identity, where being quiet, supportive, and self-denying becomes the only way to relate to others. In adulthood, egoism creates imbalanced dynamics. Egoists often partner with people who are more dominant, expressive, or demanding. It's not necessarily because they want to, but because it's familiar. The emotional focus stays on the other person. Their job becomes managing, calming, or accommodating, while their own voice gets quieter. Inside, this can lead to a quiet buildup of resentment, sadness, and loneliness. When needs are never voiced, they can't be met. When feelings are always filtered, authenticity fades. And when identity is built around not being too much, any desire to be seen, celebrated, or chosen can trigger shame. The fear isn't just about being noticed, it's about being wrong for being noticed. There's a deep-rooted belief that self-expression is dangerous, that it will somehow lead to harm, conflict, or abandonment, so even positive attention can feel threatening. Being recognized, loved, or asked to share space might feel foreign or undeserved. This isn't about lacking personality or confidence. Egoists can be intelligent, charismatic, and emotionally perceptive, but all of that gets tucked away beneath self-monitoring. Every sentence is reviewed before it's said. Every emotion is filtered for appropriateness. Every interaction is calibrated to avoid being a burden. What makes egoism difficult to break is how often it's praised. You're so easygoing. You never make things about yourself. you're so selfless. But selflessness isn't the same as wholeness, and constant self-erasure, even when polite, becomes a kind of internal exile. Unlearning egoism means recognizing that space isn't something to earn. It's something every person is allowed to take up. That visibility doesn't mean arrogance, that asking doesn't make someone selfish, and that showing up fully isn't a threat to others, it's a return to self, because the goal isn't to become loud, it's to become real without apology. Learned helplessness when the mind stops trying before the body does. Learned helplessness is the quiet surrender that forms after too many failed attempts, too many ignored needs, or too many situations where control was an illusion. It's not about laziness or weakness. It's about exhaustion that's been mistaken for indifference, a pattern where someone stops trying, not because they don't want to succeed, but because they've been conditioned to believe that effort doesn't matter. This mental state often forms in environments where action was repeatedly met with failure or punishment. A child whose voice was ignored may stop speaking up. A person in a toxic relationship may stop setting boundaries. A worker in a rigid system may stop offering ideas. Over time, the message takes root. Nothing I do will change anything. Learned helplessness isn't the same as giving up. It's more insidious than that. It happens when the nervous system starts conserving energy for survival instead of change. The belief becomes automatic. Why try if trying only leads to disappointment? It's a quiet resignation that shapes behavior long before it's ever spoken aloud. This pattern can affect all areas of life: relationships, careers, mental health, personal goals. Someone may stay in situations that are unfulfilling or even harmful, not because they lack awareness, but because they've learned that fighting back leads nowhere. They've adapted to powerlessness, and now it feels like reality. People with learned helplessness often struggle to identify or pursue their own needs. They may defer to others, minimize their desires, or wait for external permission to act. Even when opportunities arise, the internal response is often hesitation, distrust, or outright refusal. Not because of lack of desire, but because of deep-rooted fear that it's not going to work. Ironically, these individuals are often resilient in other ways. They've learned how to endure. They've survived chaos, inconsistency, or neglect, but they haven't learned that their actions can create change. And without that bridge between effort and outcome, motivation slowly dissolves. The effects of learned helplessness can resemble depression or apathy, low energy, low confidence, a sense of being stuck. But under the surface, there's usually a story of overextension, of trying too hard for too long without reward. The helplessness isn't natural. It's learned through repetition, through disappointment, through silence. Unlearning this pattern doesn't come from being told, just try harder. That only deepens the shame. The process begins by proving in small, consistent ways that choice still matters, that boundaries can be honored, that needs can be met, that not every attempt leads to failure, and that belief rebuilds slowly, not through pressure, but through evidence. A decision that lands, a voice that's heard, a step forward that actually moves something. Each small win rewrites the script. And eventually, the mind starts to remember, not everything is out of reach, because helplessness wasn't born in the self. It was learned in survival, and it can be unlearned too, one moment of agency at a time. Social fatigue, when conversation drains more than silence restores. Social fatigue is the quiet exhaustion that builds from too much interaction, too much stimulation, or too much emotional output, even when the people involved are loved and the moments are meaningful. It's not antisocial behavior. It's not introversion in disguise. It's the crash that follows social overload, the point where words start to feel heavy, smiles become harder to hold, and the urge to disappear becomes urgent. This isn't about disliking people, it's about capacity. And capacity changes based on energy, emotional state, sensory input, and what life is already asking. A calm afternoon of conversation might feel fine one day and completely overwhelming the next. Because social fatigue isn't just about what's happening around someone, it's about what's already happening within them. For some, the fatigue sets in slowly. After hours of socializing, there's a soft withdrawal, a sense that they need to be alone, not because anything went wrong, but because they can feel their internal battery draining. For others, it hits like a wall. 1 minute they're present, engaged. The next, they're gone, still physically there, but mentally checked out, emotionally shut down. This exhaustion often builds in people who are highly sensitive, introverted, neurodivergent, emotionally attuned, or simply stretched thin by life. They notice everything, the tone shifts, the subtext, the tiny social cues. Their brains work overtime to track group dynamics, manage facial expressions, respond correctly, and keep conversations flowing. It's not just interacting, it's performing, and performance burns energy. Add in environments that are loud, chaotic, or overstimulating, crowds, events, long meetings. And the fatigue compounds. What's supposed to be fun or productive starts to feel like a slow leak of self. And afterward? There's a recovery phase. Some need silence, some need darkness. Some need a full day of no plans, no conversation, no expectations. Social fatigue also affects people in caretaking roles, therapists, teachers, healthcare workers, customer-facing staff. Anyone whose job demands constant presence, emotional labor, or responsiveness. Even if the conversations are calm, they still cost something. Over time, that cost adds up. One of the more misunderstood aspects of social fatigue is how much it can happen during pleasant interactions. People assume that if someone's smiling and laughing, they must be recharged. But some of the most socially exhausted people are the ones who are also the best at playing along, the ones who know how to keep a room light, the ones who leave the gathering and immediately collapse. The guilt that follows can be just as draining. Why can't I handle what others seem to enjoy? Why do I need more space than everyone else? Is there something wrong with me? But the truth is, everyone has a different baseline for stimulation, and some nervous systems are simply wired to require longer recovery periods after connection. There is also pressure to be on all the time. Social media extends the reach of social interaction far beyond physical gatherings. Messages, comments, notifications. The expectation to respond, to be available, to maintain digital presence can create a layer of fatigue that never fully turns off. The antidote isn't isolation, it's intentional solitude, not disappearing, but decompressing. Space where there's no expectation to perform, no script to follow, no emotional field to track, just quiet, just stillness, just self. Recovery from social fatigue often involves resetting the nervous system. Movement, music, time in nature, time in silence, journaling, even mindless entertainment. Whatever helps soften the overstimulation and bring attention inward. These aren't indulgences, they're necessities, and it helps to set boundaries before the crash. Not every invite needs a yes. Not every message needs a reply right now. Sometimes the most social thing someone can do is protect the energy they'll need for the next moment that truly matters. Social fatigue isn't rudeness. It's a signal. Not that people are bad, but that presence has a limit, and honoring that limit is the first step to showing up fully again when it really counts. Catastrophic thinking. When every small worry spirals into the worst-case scenario. Catastrophic thinking is the mental habit of imagining the worst possible outcome, often suddenly, often irrationally, and almost always with more intensity than the situation calls for. A headache becomes a brain tumor. A delayed reply means a relationship is ending. A minor mistake at work leads to job loss, public humiliation, and total collapse. It's not just worry, it's the brain speeding to the edge of disaster without brakes. This mental spiral usually starts with a small trigger. Something goes wrong, or even just slightly off plan, and the mind starts forecasting disaster. Logic might try to intervene, but fear moves faster. The worst-case scenario begins to feel not only possible, but inevitable. Emotion overrides probability, and suddenly everything is on fire. People who deal with catastrophic thinking often know their fears are exaggerated. That doesn't make them any easier to stop. The anxiety doesn't ask for permission. It leaps ahead and fills in the blanks with disaster. One unanswered question becomes a narrative. One unexpected variable becomes a threat. The ability to wait and see is replaced with an urgent need to prepare for collapse, for conflict, for catastrophe. At its root, this kind of thinking is about control. The mind tries to prepare for pain before it happens, believing that imagining the worst can soften the blow if it comes, but more often it just extends the suffering. The bad thing hasn't happened and may never happen, but emotionally it already has. This pattern can come from past experiences where unexpected events caused real harm. Trauma, loss, betrayal. These moments teach the brain that safety can disappear suddenly. Catastrophic thinking becomes a defense mechanism. Brace for impact so you're never caught off guard again. The downside is that the nervous system starts living in a state of permanent bracing. It also steals peace from the present. Even good moments come with a shadow. What if this doesn't last? What if something bad happens right after this? Joy becomes hard to hold because the mind is already scanning for the threat that will take it away. And once the spiral begins, it's hard to redirect. The brain starts feeding on its own fear. Relationships are deeply affected too. A partner's silence becomes a signal of distance. A friend's delayed reply feels like rejection. Reassurance is craved constantly, but it never sticks for long. The fear regenerates quickly, creating cycles of need and withdrawal, panic and shame. This kind of thinking doesn't respond well to logic in the moment. Telling someone it's probably fine rarely helps because the fear isn't based on facts, it's based on what-ifs. What helps more is interruption, a shift in pace, a grounding reminder of what's actually happening, not what might happen. Creating space between the trigger and the spiral is often the first step toward regaining clarity. Over time, the mind can relearn its patterns. It takes consistency to replace worst-case defaults with more balanced thinking, not toxic positivity, but curiosity. What else could be true? What's most likely here? It's about learning to challenge the urge to panic without denying the fear that fuels it. Because catastrophic thinking isn't drama, it's protection. But protection built on fear eventually becomes a prison. And sometimes the freedom starts with one slow breath, one grounded moment, and one quiet reminder. Not everything that feels like danger is. Invisible loneliness when you're surrounded, but still alone. Invisible loneliness isn't defined by isolation. It can exist in crowded rooms, close relationships, and full calendars. It's not the absence of people. It's the absence of connection that lands. It's the ache of feeling unseen, even when others are looking right at you. This form of loneliness is hard to explain because it doesn't come from a lack of social contact. It comes from a lack of resonance. Conversations stay on the surface. Smiles don't reach the heart. You laugh at the right times, answer all the messages, go to all the gatherings, and still walk away feeling like no one really knows you. The pain is subtle but persistent. It's in the pauses that stretch too long after you speak, in the moments where you're listening deeply, but no one ever asks in return. In the reflex to say, "I'm fine," even when you're not, because it's easier than opening a door that no one seems ready to walk through. Often, invisible loneliness builds over time. Sometimes it follows change, moving cities, growing, apart from old friends starting over in adulthood. Sometimes it happens in long-standing relationships that were once fulfilling but no longer feel emotionally alive. And sometimes it's always been there, familiar, a low hum in the background. The hardest part is the mismatch between appearance and reality. From the outside, everything might look okay. Social media shows activity, not intimacy. People assume things are fine because you're always around. But presence isn't the same as closeness, and being surrounded isn't the same as being known. Invisible loneliness often breeds self-doubt. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe I'm not interesting enough. The mind turns inward, trying to make sense of the disconnect. It becomes harder to reach out, harder to be vulnerable, harder to believe that deeper connection is possible. And yet, the hunger doesn't go away. The longing to be seen clearly, to be heard fully, to be held in a way that doesn't feel transactional. Not out of neediness, but because connection is a human requirement. The nervous system is wired to seek resonance. Without it, everything starts to feel a little less real. Invisible loneliness can also lead to emotional masking, performing energy, pretending things are fine, taking care of everyone else's needs while ignoring your own. It becomes a quiet strategy. If connection can't be found, at least rejection can be avoided, so the mask stays up, the real feelings stay in. Healing from this kind of loneliness isn't about increasing the number of people in your life. It's about deepening the quality of presence. It starts with honesty. Not performative openness, but real grounded sharing, first with yourself, then with others who show signs of readiness. Sometimes, it's not about finding the right people, it's about allowing people to meet the real version of you. Even if it feels risky, even if it's been years since you felt that kind of safety, because invisible loneliness doesn't mean you're unlovable. It means you've been unseen for too long, and being seen truly is still possible, even if it starts with one conversation that goes a little deeper than usual. Delayed adolescence. When adulthood arrives before readiness does, delayed adolescence is the experience of reaching the responsibilities of adulthood without ever fully living through the freedom, experimentation, or emotional development typically associated with adolescence. It's not immaturity. It's not failure. It's a pause that got skipped and a stage that starts knocking later, when things were supposed to be settled. This state can look like a grown adult suddenly chasing the kinds of experiences that were missed years ago: impulsive decisions, rebellion, identity shifts, or even a new wave of self-discovery. It might show up as quitting a job suddenly, changing style, rethinking life paths, starting over. The urge isn't to regress, it's to reclaim something that was never allowed in the first place. For many, adolescence wasn't a time of safe exploration. Maybe the environment was unstable, the family system demanded adult behavior too early, or the person took on emotional labor before they could fully develop their own emotional landscape. There may have been trauma, illness, caretaking, poverty, or pressure to be mature for your age. Whatever the cause, the natural messiness of adolescence got skipped or compressed into something far too neat. But development doesn't disappear just because it was postponed. Emotional growth has a way of looping back when life finally creates space for it. In some cases, this catch-up process begins in the late 20s or 30s. For others, it arrives even later, triggered by a life event, a crisis, or a sudden realization that the self being lived isn't the one that was ever consciously chosen. This delayed phase can feel destabilizing. From the outside, it might look like someone losing it, becoming reckless, or making bad choices. But from the inside, it often feels like waking up, like getting to breathe for the first time without a script, like finally asking, "What do I want?" and hearing silence because the answer's never been safe to explore until now. There may be guilt or confusion. Why now? Why can't I just be settled like everyone else? But the truth is, comparison doesn't account for pacing. Everyone grows on a different timeline, and those who had to prioritize survival early in life often have to make space for self-exploration much later. Delayed adolescence isn't inherently destructive, but it can become chaotic without some internal anchor. The process of experimentation, boundary pushing, or identity shifting needs room to unfold, but also reflection to integrate what's being discovered. It's not just about making up for lost time. It's about discovering time that was never fully lived. This phase may involve grief. Grieving the years that felt stolen, the childhood or teenage years that were spent managing, not dreaming, the choices made from pressure instead of desire. But grief can coexist with renewal. The opportunity to explore, play, rebel, and redefine the self still exists. It just shows up out of sequence. Relationships may shift during this process. People around might struggle to understand the change. "You've changed" may be said like an accusation, but often it's just an emergence. A part of the self that had been quiet or hidden is finally stepping forward, not to discard everything from before, but to build something more aligned. The key to navigating delayed adolescence is self-compassion, understanding that this isn't failure. It's development on a delayed clock. The emotional system is catching up. That might mean saying no more often, dressing differently, asking big questions, changing the rules, making mistakes. All of that is part of the process. There's also a deeper psychological truth at play. The parts of the self that were denied don't just disappear, they wait. And when they finally get a voice, it's not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. Delayed adolescence doesn't mean someone is behind. It means they're arriving on their own terms, at their own pace, ready to finally become who they were always meant to be. Analysis. Paralysis when overthinking becomes a full-body freeze. Analysis paralysis is the mental gridlock that happens when the brain spins in circles around a decision, gathering data, weighing options, considering consequences, without ever arriving at a conclusion. It's not just thinking deeply, it's thinking so much for so long that forward movement becomes impossible. This state is especially common in situations where the outcome carries emotional weight, career decisions, relationships, major life changes, or creative projects. The stakes don't have to be objectively high. What matters is that they feel high. One wrong move feels like it could collapse everything. So instead of deciding, the mind loops and loops and loops. The process often starts with a genuine desire to make the right choice. The mind wants to be thorough, responsible, thoughtful. It gathers information, plays out scenarios, consults with others, revisits old options. But the longer it goes on, the harder it gets to separate clarity from fear. Every path starts to look risky. Every detail starts to matter too much. Doubt creeps in, not just about the decision, but about one's own ability to decide at all. Eventually, the act of choosing itself becomes painful. The brain delays. The task gets pushed to tomorrow and then to the next day. Avoidance becomes a relief until the weight of the unmade choice returns, heavier than before. People experiencing analysis paralysis often seem cautious or indecisive from the outside. But internally, the mind is working overtime. It's not a lack of effort, it's effort without resolution. And that level of sustained mental activity is exhausting. It drains energy, lowers confidence, and creates a kind of emotional static that makes even simple decisions feel overwhelming. Perfectionism is often at the root. The belief that the right choice must be flawless, that any misstep is a personal failure, that once a decision is made, it must never be regretted. This creates an impossible standard where certainty is required before any action can be taken. But in real life, certainty rarely comes first. It's often the result of doing, not the condition for it. This paralysis is also reinforced by fear of consequences. What if this hurts someone? What if I look stupid? What if I waste time, money, or energy? What if I regret this? These questions are valid, but when they dominate the decision-making process, they create a mental environment where safety becomes more important than truth. Social pressure can worsen it. Watching others move forward, make bold choices, or commit to paths can make one's own inaction feel more shameful. But what's often invisible is that many people are also unsure. They're just better at moving through it. Analysis paralysis doesn't mean someone is behind. It means their internal safety system is on high alert. So, what helps? Often, it's about shifting the goal, not to find the perfect choice, but to find a workable one, not to eliminate all risk, but to build tolerance for uncertainty. To recognize that decisions don't have to be permanent, and most outcomes aren't binary. Movement, even imperfect movement, creates more clarity than thinking ever will. Small decisions help too. Practicing low-stakes choices builds confidence. Choosing where to eat, what to wear, what to tackle first in a day. Each small decision reinforces the idea that outcomes don't define worth, that mistakes don't erase value, that flexibility matters more than control, and sometimes the most powerful step isn't choosing between two options, it's choosing to stop spinning long enough to breathe. Because analysis paralysis isn't a lack of intelligence. It's intelligence caught in a loop, afraid to land, and the only way out is to move, not perfectly, but forward. Emotional contagion, when someone else's feelings become your own. Emotional contagion is the phenomenon where one person absorbs the emotions of another. Automatically, often unconsciously, and with surprising intensity. It's not about empathy in the deliberate sense. It's more primal, more reflexive, like a tuning fork vibrating in response to someone else's frequency. One person enters a room upset, and suddenly another feels tense. One person laughs, and others can't help but smile. The feelings spread, carried silently between nervous systems. This isn't weakness, it's biology. Human brains are wired for connection, and that connection includes emotion. Mirror neurons, specialized cells that reflect the emotions and behaviors of those around us, allow people to intuit, sense, and even feel what others are experiencing, even without words. It's how infants recognize caregivers' moods. It's how people wince at someone else's pain. It's what allows humans to function socially, but when left unchecked, it can overwhelm. For some, emotional contagion is momentary, a passing mood that lifts or dips based on those nearby. But for others, especially those who are highly sensitive, empathic, or attuned to others' energy, it becomes more intense. They begin to carry emotional states that aren't theirs, sadness that arrived without cause, anxiety that wasn't earned, anger that never belonged to them in the first place. This absorption is subtle at first. A draining conversation, a visit that leaves someone feeling off, a shift in mood after being near, someone tightly wound. The signs show up physically: tightness in the chest, a stomach drop, a headache that feels borrowed. The emotional experience starts to mimic others so closely, it becomes hard to tell where one person ends and another begins. Emotional contagion becomes more complex in close relationships, partners, families, friendships. The more connected two people are, the more porous the emotional boundary becomes. A partner's stress becomes both people's stress. One person's sadness becomes the other's mission to fix, or worse, absorb. The intention is often caring, but the result is unbalanced, one nervous system carrying the load of two. In group settings, this dynamic amplifies. Workplaces, classrooms, households, each becomes a container of shared energy. One person's Tension can subtly infect the tone of the whole environment. This is why leadership, emotional intelligence, and mood regulation matter so deeply in collective spaces. Emotions ripple, energy echoes. People particularly prone to emotional contagion often grew up in environments where reading the room was a survival skill, homes where moods were unpredictable, families where emotional safety was tied to constant vigilance. The brain learns early to scan faces, voices, energy levels for signals of threat, need, or coming storms. That vigilance becomes automatic, intuitive, exhausting. The cost of emotional contagion isn't always obvious. On the surface, it looks like being supportive, understanding, tuned in. But over time, it can lead to emotional burnout, compassion fatigue, and identity blurring. The inner world becomes crowded with feelings that never originated there. Exhaustion sets in, not because of one's own life, but because of everything carried from others. There's also a sense of guilt tied to resisting emotional absorption. If I don't feel what they feel, does that make me cold? If I stay grounded when they're in pain, am I abandoning them? But the truth is, emotional containment is not cruelty, it's clarity. It's possible to witness someone's experience without swallowing it whole. To hold empathy beside someone rather than instead of them. Boundary work becomes essential, not just in physical or verbal terms, but in emotional terms. That means checking in with oneself. Is this mine? Was I feeling this before we spoke? Does this emotion reflect something I need to move through or something I picked up and need to put down? These questions don't eliminate emotional resonance, but they help locate it. Grounding practices are powerful tools for people who absorb emotional energy. Breath work, body awareness, physical movement, time alone, nature, or rituals that reconnect someone to their own emotional center. These aren't just self-care activities, they're recalibration tools. They allow the nervous system to return to baseline, to remember what it feels like to carry only one person's emotional experience. In emotionally intense professions, therapists, teachers, healthcare workers, activists, this awareness becomes even more critical. Compassion must be coupled with containment. Otherwise, the emotional overflow can lead to depletion, cynicism, or emotional detachment. As a last resort, the goal isn't to stop feeling. It's to feel responsibly, to know the difference between connection and codependence, between resonance and enmeshment, between presence and possession, because emotional contagion, when unconscious, erases boundaries. But when acknowledged, it can become something powerful, a form of attunement that doesn't drain, but informs, that allows for connection without collapse. It starts with the quiet realization, not every emotion that enters the body is mine to hold. And sometimes the most compassionate thing one can do for both self and others is to return the feeling to where it belongs. Chronic guilt. When guilt becomes the background noise of everything. Chronic guilt is a lingering emotional state where guilt is not just a reaction to wrongdoing. It's a constant presence. It follows even when nothing has gone wrong, even when no one's upset, even when everything is, on paper, fine. It's a kind of emotional gravity, always pulling, always weighing, always reminding that somehow, somewhere, something might be your fault. This isn't the healthy kind of guilt that prompts self-reflection or encourages repair. Chronic guilt is excessive, often irrational, and usually disconnected from the actual events at hand. It doesn't wait for mistakes, it preempts them. A conversation goes quiet and guilt appears. Someone is sad and guilt assumes responsibility. Saying no, setting a boundary, even just taking up space, each becomes an emotional transaction that demands guilt in return. People who carry chronic guilt often have no clear origin story for it, but patterns usually trace back to environments where they were made to feel responsible for others' emotions. In childhood, This can look like caretaking parents, mediating family conflicts, or being told directly or indirectly that one's actions or existence caused stress, disappointment, or burden. The guilt takes root early. If someone's unhappy, it must be because of me. If someone leaves, it's because of something I did. If someone's hurting, it's my job to fix it. Over time, guilt becomes a reflex, not a response to something wrong, but a way of existing, a feeling that shows up not when it's needed, but just in case. This kind of guilt is often tied to being highly empathetic. People who feel everything deeply are especially vulnerable to taking on emotions that don't belong to them. They sense discomfort in a room and immediately begin calculating what they might have done to cause it. Their emotional radar is always scanning for disappointment, disapproval, potential rupture. What makes chronic guilt so exhausting is how it infiltrates even the most minor decisions. Declining an invitation, taking time for oneself, prioritizing personal needs. All of it comes with a layer of internal pushback. Who did I inconvenience? Who did I let down? Who's upset because I chose myself? It also pairs perfectly with over-apologizing. Saying sorry becomes a default setting, not because there's genuine wrongdoing, but because the discomfort of potentially having caused harm, real or imagined, is too much to bear. The apology isn't always for the other person. It's a way to self-soothe, to manage the guilt before it builds too loudly. Relationships become complicated under this pattern. Chronic guilt creates one-sided dynamics. The person who carries it overfunctions, checking in constantly, trying to anticipate needs, offering help without being asked. It's not that they don't want reciprocity, they just feel too guilty to expect it. So the balance tips. Resentment builds, and yet even that resentment can spark guilt. Even success can trigger it. Survivor's guilt. Guilt for doing well. When others are struggling, guilt for outgrowing old roles, leaving people behind, changing. Joy becomes dimmed by the feeling that someone else has less, or that happiness somehow disrespects others' pain. Breaking the cycle of chronic guilt doesn't start with logic. It starts with permission, the permission to exist without explanation, to have needs without shame, to say no without a justification speech, to stop taking responsibility for things that were never yours to carry. It also means redefining what it means to be good. Because chronic guilt is often tangled up with identity. Good people feel guilty, good people overextend, good people sacrifice. But real goodness includes sustainability, boundaries, rest. The ability to say, "That's not mine," and let it be true. Healing from chronic guilt takes time. It requires unlearning the idea that guilt equals care, that suffering equals sincerity, that pleasing others is always the right thing. It means learning to sit with discomfort without self-punishment, and knowing that being loved or safe or free doesn't have to come at the cost of constant apology, because guilt is meant to be a signal, not a soundtrack, and life doesn't need to be lived under constant emotional debt to prove it's being lived right. Rejection. Sensitivity when no doesn't just hurt, it echoes. Rejection sensitivity is a heightened emotional response to the possibility, real or imagined, of being rejected, criticized, or left out. It's not just a fear of hearing no, it's the deep, immediate pain that comes with perceived disapproval, disinterest, or emotional distance. Even small signals, a late reply, a shift in tone, a forgotten invite, can trigger a storm of self-doubt and emotional withdrawal. It doesn't take much to set it off. A message read but not answered. A joke that lands flat. A missed glance. For most, these are minor, forgettable moments. But for someone with rejection sensitivity, they're amplified. The brain fills in the gaps quickly. They're upset. With me, I said something wrong. They're losing interest. The narrative doesn't wait for evidence. It builds itself in seconds. The emotional impact is sharp and consuming. It can feel like being cut off, exposed, or suddenly not belonging. And it doesn't just sting, it spirals. The mind replays the moment, analyzes every word, tone, silence. The heart races, the body tenses. It becomes a full system alert. What makes rejection sensitivity especially challenging is that it operates in anticipation as much as reaction. It's not just the fact of rejection, it's the threat of it. Many decisions, conversations, or expressions get filtered through the fear of how they might be received. Vulnerability becomes calculated. Honesty becomes rehearsed. The self becomes edited in real time. This experience is often rooted in earlier wounds, being criticized harshly, emotionally neglected, excluded, or made to feel like love was conditional. Over time, the nervous system adapts. It learns that rejection doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes. So it tries to get ahead of it, predict it, avoid it. And in doing so, it begins to see rejection everywhere, even where it doesn't exist. People with rejection sensitivity are usually highly perceptive. They notice tone shifts, pick up on micro-expressions, catch subtle cues others miss. But this sensitivity often works against them. It leads to misreading neutral behavior as negative. A person being quiet is seen as annoyed. A friend being distracted is interpreted as distance. The assumption isn't just that rejection might happen, it's that it already has. This leads to self-protective behaviors, pulling away before someone else can, over-apologizing, people-pleasing, avoiding expressing needs because needs might be too much. In relationships, this can create an exhausting pattern: closeness, panic, withdrawal, guilt, repeat. And because rejection sensitivity is often internalized, it creates a painful loop. I'm too sensitive. I'm a burden. They'll leave if I keep reacting this way. The fear of rejection becomes fused with shame about the fear itself. It's not just emotional pain, it's emotional exile. But rejection sensitivity doesn't mean someone is weak. It means their system has been trained to scan for threat where others see calm. And while the response may feel automatic, it's not fixed. With awareness, the loop can be slowed. The mind can be taught to pause before assuming, to ask, is there another explanation? Am I responding to what happened or what I feared happened? Supportive relationships help. Ones where communication is open, where feedback is kind, where reassurance isn't earned but freely given. These are the spaces where nervous systems can start to relax, where rejection doesn't feel like a personal collapse but a survivable moment. Healing isn't about becoming bulletproof. It's about becoming stable enough to weather rejection without erasure, to hear no and not lose your sense of self, to be left out and not translate it into worthlessness, to be criticized and still hold on to your center. Rejection hurts. That's human. But sensitivity to it doesn't have to mean fragility. It can mean depth, awareness, care. And when channeled with compassion, it can even become strength. Cognitive dissonance, when the mind tries to hold two truths that don't fit together. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort that arises when two beliefs, values, or actions are in conflict with one another. It's not just confusion, it's tension, a quiet or sometimes deafening psychological pressure that demands resolution. Something doesn't match, and the brain feels it. Deeply, it might be the person who believes in honesty but tells a lie, the one who values health but smokes, the one who loves their partner but feels unfulfilled, the employee who prides themselves on integrity but stays silent in the face of wrongdoing. These aren't contradictions born of hypocrisy. They're often the result of complex, real-world decisions that don't allow for easy alignment between belief and behavior. When cognitive dissonance hits, it creates a kind of mental itch. The dissonance itself is uncomfortable, so the brain immediately begins working to reduce it. It will justify, rationalize, minimize, or reframe the situation to create internal consistency. Everyone lies sometimes. It's just one cigarette. I'm lucky to have any relationship at all. Speaking up won't change anything. This adjustment isn't necessarily dishonest, it's protective. The mind hates living in contradiction. Holding conflicting beliefs feels unstable, so it chooses the easier path. Resolve the tension by changing the narrative. But that doesn't mean the deeper dissonance disappears. Often it lingers just beneath the surface, creating stress, guilt, or emotional disconnection. Cognitive dissonance plays a major role in decision-making and identity. It shows up in politics, religion, relationships, ethics. Someone might hold a belief that clashes with new evidence, or find that the group they belong to no longer aligns with their values. That gap creates mental static, and what a person does next can reshape how they see themselves. Some people double down. They cling tighter to one belief and reject the other completely. Others rewrite their internal stories to create new alignment, and some sit in the discomfort, letting the dissonance remain unresolved for days, months, even years. Because reconciling internal conflict requires more than logic, it requires emotional honesty and often courage. This process can be painful. Realizing that a long-held belief no longer serves, admitting that a relationship isn't what it seemed, facing the gap between how one wants to act and how one actually has. It challenges not just opinions, but identity. And identity is rarely something people change lightly, but dissonance isn't always negative. In fact, it can be a signal of growth. It means the mind is paying attention, resisting autopilot, questioning patterns. It shows up when someone is emotionally alive enough to notice, this no longer fits. This doesn't feel right. This needs to change. The danger comes when dissonance is ignored for too long. That internal split can lead to anxiety, burnout, shame, or even numbness. Living in contradiction drains energy. It requires constant internal negotiation, and eventually it wears down the trust someone has in their own thoughts, choices, or instincts. To work through cognitive dissonance, the first step is awareness, naming the two opposing truths without flinching. I believe in kindness, but I hurt someone. I value independence, but I'm staying in a situation that limits me. The discomfort might rise, but that's the start of resolution. The next step isn't always a full reversal. It might be realignment, adjusting a belief to match new experience, or changing behavior to reflect deeper values, or sitting in the gray, allowing time and experience to reveal the next right step. Dissonance isn't a failure. It's a fork in the road, because life is complicated, people change, beliefs evolve, and the ability to recognize contradiction is not weakness, it's self-awareness. It means something inside is refusing to accept an easy lie. It means the soul is still striving for coherence, for integrity, for truth. Cognitive dissonance doesn't mean someone is broken. It means the truth is knocking, loud enough now that it can't be ignored. Disenfranchised grief, when the world doesn't see the loss, but you still carry it. Disenfranchised grief is the kind of grief that doesn't get recognition. It's mourning that happens in silence, without validation, support, or shared acknowledgement. There's no funeral, no public sympathy, no script for how to heal. The loss is real, but invisible, and that invisibility makes it heavier. This form of grief comes from losses that society doesn't know how to name or chooses not to recognize as legitimate. A breakup, a miscarriage, the death of a pet, the loss of a dream, estrangement from a family member, leaving a religion, losing mobility, losing time, even grieving someone who's still alive, just not in your life anymore. These experiences don't fit into traditional models of grief. There's no official language for them, so they often get minimized or dismissed. It's not like someone died. You'll move on. It happens to everyone. The result is emotional dissonance, pain that's intense but not seen. And when grief isn't seen, it doesn't go away. It just burrows deeper. Disenfranchised grief also comes with confusion. Without validation, people begin to doubt their own pain. Am I being dramatic? Why am I still upset about this? Shouldn't I be over it by now? The grief is real, but it exists in a vacuum. No rituals, no casseroles, just silence. One of the hardest parts of this grief is the isolation it creates. The loss can't be easily explained, so it stays internal. Even among friends and family, there may be no way to communicate what's missing or why it matters so much. So the grieving person stays quiet, pretends to be okay, moves forward on the outside while standing still on the inside. And yet, the emotional process of disenfranchised grief is just as intense as any other kind. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, maybe even acceptance, but it comes slowly, unevenly, and without a guide. The grieving person becomes their own witness, their own comforter, their own support system. Because no one else sees what was lost or why it matters so deeply. This grief often lingers longer precisely because it hasn't been expressed. Suppressed pain doesn't disappear. It compounds. It sneaks into other parts of life. Shows up as irritability, fatigue, numbness, or surfaces years later, triggered by an unrelated loss. That's the thing about grief. It doesn't expire. It waits to be felt. Disenfranchised grief also intersects with identity. For example, someone grieving a non-traditional relationship may feel judged for the depth of their pain. Someone grieving the end of a job that defined their identity may feel silly mourning something others would call just work. And people grieving trauma they never told anyone about may carry both grief and secrecy. Healing from disenfranchised grief starts with acknowledgement, even if it's private at first, giving the loss a name, writing it down, saying it out loud, letting yourself mourn what didn't get a headline, but still broke something inside. Grief doesn't need permission to be real, but it does need space to move. Creating that space often means rejecting the idea that grief must be justified. You don't need a eulogy to miss someone. You don't need a diagnosis to grieve lost time. You don't need permission to fall apart over something the world thinks you should be over. If it mattered to you, the grief is real. Support doesn't always have to come from people who understand. Sometimes it comes from people who are willing to listen. Grief groups, therapists, friends who don't need the whole backstory. Just someone to say, "That sounds heavy. I believe you." That kind of witness can change everything. Disenfranchised grief doesn't mean the loss was small. It means the world didn't know how to hold it. But you can. And in time, others can. Learn to hold it with you. Toxic productivity, when rest feels like failure and doing enough never is. Toxic productivity is the compulsion to be constantly working, achieving, and producing, regardless of the cost. It's productivity turned obsession. It's when value is measured only by output, when identity is tied to performance, and when rest doesn't feel restorative. It feels guilty. On the surface, it looks like success. The packed schedule, the crossed-off to-do lists, the early mornings and late nights. But underneath, it's often driven by fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of being seen as lazy, fear that without constant movement, worth disappears. The hustle isn't always about ambition. It's about anxiety. This mindset doesn't just reward hard work, it requires it. Breaks become suspect. Stillness feels dangerous. Even during downtime, the brain doesn't shut off. It starts planning the next task, worrying about what's being missed, feeling behind in imaginary competitions no one else is playing. Toxic productivity often stems from deep conditioning. Many people grew up in environments where love, praise, or safety was linked to achievement. Good grades, extra effort, constant responsibility. Over time, they learned that rest wasn't neutral. It was a threat to their place in the world. Do less, be less. It's reinforced culturally too, especially in systems that reward overwork, glorify burnout, and treat exhaustion as a badge of honor. Rise and grind. No days off. Sleep when you're dead. The messaging is clear. Your value is what you do, not how you feel, not who you are, just what you produce. This belief quietly infiltrates every area of life. Rest becomes strategic instead of soothing. Hobbies turn into side hustles. Even self-care gets optimized. Meditation apps, workout tracking, reading goals. There's no space for doing something just because. Everything must have an outcome, a result, a metric. But this pace is unsustainable. It leads to burnout, emotional numbness, and eventually, breakdown. The warning signs are easy to ignore at first. Fatigue, irritability, brain fog, but they escalate. The body keeps score. The mind starts to fracture under the pressure. And eventually, something gives. Ironically, people caught in toxic productivity loops are often the most passionate, driven, and capable. They want to contribute. They want to do well. But they haven't learned that worth doesn't evaporate in stillness. That existing is not a passive act. That life is not meant to be one endless checklist. The guilt attached to rest is a powerful symptom. I should be doing more. I haven't earned this break. Other people have it, harder. These thoughts aren't truths, they're echoes. Internalized scripts passed down from systems that treat humans like machines. Breaking out of this mindset isn't about doing nothing. It's about redefining value. It's remembering that growth happens in stillness, too. That creativity needs boredom. That the nervous system needs pause. That bodies are not built for constant output. Rest is not a reward for productivity. Rest is a right, a need, a recalibration. Healing from toxic productivity means unlearning the belief that busyness is proof of worth. It means sitting with the discomfort of doing nothing and learning that the sky doesn't fall. It means asking, who am I if I'm not constantly performing? And being brave enough to find the answer. Because the point of life is not to optimize it to death. It's to live it, fully, imperfectly, and without apology. Ambiguous loss, when what's missing hasn't really gone, but can't fully return. Ambiguous loss is a type of grief that doesn't have clear edges. It's the pain of losing something, or someone, that hasn't fully disappeared, but also isn't entirely present. There's no closure, no clean break, no finality. Just a constant emotional limbo where the mind keeps reaching for what it can't hold. This kind of loss is hard to name, harder to explain, and nearly impossible to resolve. It doesn't come with rituals or support. There's no funeral, no goodbye, no cultural script for what to do. It leaves people mourning without acknowledgement, stuck between hope and helplessness. There are two primary forms of ambiguous loss. The first is physical absence with psychological presence, when someone is gone, but not clearly or permanently. A missing person, a loved one who left without explanation, a parent who abandoned the family but remains alive somewhere in the world. The mind holds on to them even as the body is gone. The second is psychological absence with physical presence, when someone is still there, but not in the way they once were. A partner with dementia, a child with severe addiction, a parent emotionally shut down from trauma. They exist, but not as the version of themselves that was once known. They're present, but not reachable. Both types of ambiguous loss wreak havoc on the emotional system. Traditional grief follows a timeline, however, unpredictable, but ambiguous loss has no endpoint, no confirmation, no certainty. That keeps the nervous system in a state of alert, always scanning for signs, always asking, is it over? Are they coming back? Am I allowed to let go? This emotional holding pattern can last for years, decades. A person might outwardly appear moved on, but internally they're still locked in that moment of disappearance or transformation. The pain doesn't dull with time, It just becomes quieter, more private. A weight that sits behind the ribs and never fully shifts. Because the loss isn't recognized publicly, the grief often turns inward. People blame themselves. Maybe I didn't try hard enough. Maybe if I had said something differently. The mind spins on loops of imagined alternatives, trying to rewrite something it never controlled to begin with. Ambiguous loss is especially cruel in relationships. It interferes with bonding, with memory, with identity. Someone might feel guilty for missing a version of a person who technically still exists. They might feel disloyal for building a new life, or trapped, unsure whether they're abandoning someone or saving themselves. What makes this grief so corrosive is that it resists resolution. There's no final story to tell, no moment of closure, just ambiguity, circling like weather. A parent who never reconnected, a best friend who faded away, a sibling who changed beyond recognition, a former self that feels too far gone to retrieve. But ambiguous loss doesn't mean healing is impossible. It just means healing looks different. It starts with recognition, naming the grief for what it is, even if no one else sees it. Giving. Language takes it out of isolation. It means saying, I lost something real, even when it's invisible. Next comes redefining hope. Not hoping for return or reversal, but for peace, for meaning, for new stories that don't erase the past, but don't freeze in it either. It means shifting from waiting to living, and finally, it requires boundary setting. With oneself, with others, with the loss itself. Deciding when to revisit and when to rest. Allowing memories without being consumed by them. Accepting the ambiguity without letting it paralyze the present. Because not every loss fits the frame, and not every goodbye is spoken aloud. But even the losses that live in limbo deserve to be mourned, and eventually released. Post-achievement depression, when success feels like nothing at all. Post-achievement depression is the strange emotional crash that happens after a major win. The goal was hit, the project launched, the diploma awarded, the race run, the milestone reached, the long-sought moment finally arrived. And instead of euphoria, there's a quiet emptiness, maybe even sadness, maybe even a deep sense of, now what? This isn't ingratitude, it's not drama, it's not just being difficult. It's the emotional hangover that happens when something anticipated for months or years is suddenly behind you. The climb consumed everything, the peak came and went. And now, there's stillness and silence, and an internal blank page where purpose used to sit. People experiencing post-achievement depression often feel confused and guilty. I should be happy. Other people would kill for this. Why do I feel worse now than before I even started? But emotion doesn't always follow logic, especially not when someone's identity has been built around striving, struggling, and earning. When the struggle ends, it can feel like the self goes quiet too. Sometimes the goal itself was never quite personal. It was inherited. A degree to make a parent proud, a job that seemed prestigious, a marriage, a house, a number in a bank account. The finish line was chosen but not questioned. So when it's crossed, there's no internal payoff, just the realization that you climbed the wrong mountain or climbed it too fast to even feel it. Other times, the goal was personal, deeply personal, a passion project, a hard-fought battle, something that meant everything. But when something consumes your energy for that long, its end can feel like a kind of death. The structure it gave to your days is gone. The anticipation that kept you going is spent. The identity it formed is no longer needed. Post-achievement. Depression doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it's apathy. Sometimes it's irritability, restlessness, or disconnection. Things that used to feel meaningful now feel flat. New goals feel hollow. Old routines don't fit anymore. The compass spins but doesn't point anywhere clear. It also tends to be isolating. Success is supposed to be celebrated when someone talks about feeling low after a big win, they're often met with confusion or dismissal. Enjoy it. You should be proud. What's wrong with you? So the feelings stay hidden. The mask goes up. The party goes on without them. This crash is more common in high achievers, perfectionists, and people whose self-worth is tied tightly to productivity. When success becomes a source of identity, the loss of the chase becomes a loss of self. They were the student, the artist, the builder, the fighter. Now that it's done, who are they? But post-achievement depression isn't a flaw. It's feedback. It's the psyche asking bigger questions. Was I chasing meaning or momentum? Did this goal reflect who I am or who I was trying to prove I could be? What parts of me got muted? During the climb, recovery begins with rest, not strategic rest, not rest as a reward. Actual uncomfortable stillness, letting the system exhale, letting the heart catch up to the pace the body kept, letting grief surface. Because yes, even success can come with grief. Then comes reflection, not rushing into the next mountain, but asking what future peaks are worth climbing. What would it look like to choose goals that feed now, not just later? What does it mean to build a life where the in-between moments carry meaning, not just the finish lines? Eventually, post-achievement depression shifts. The silence becomes space. The flatness becomes potential. The identity that once centered around success begins to include softness, stillness, curiosity, because achievement, no matter how impressive, is not the same as fulfillment. And the moment after the win might not be bright, but it's wide open. Identity foreclosure, when a life gets chosen before the self does. Identity foreclosure is when a person commits to an identity, career, role, belief system, relationship path, without fully exploring alternatives. It's not just about certainty. It's about prematurely locking into a version of the self that was never fully questioned. Because questioning felt unsafe, unnecessary, or unacceptable. Often, this identity isn't chosen freely. It's inherited, passed down from family, implied by culture, shaped by early praise, pressure, or survival instincts. The child who's told they're the smart one or the helper builds a personality around being reliable, agreeable, high-achieving. The teen who's expected to take over the family business or follow a prescribed life plan never gets a chance to ask, what do I actually want? On the surface, identity foreclosure can look like direction. These are people who seem to have it together. The straight A student with the 5-year plan, the employee who rises fast in a job they never questioned, the partner who gets married young because it was the next step in the script. From the outside, it looks like success. But on the inside, there's often a quiet dissonance, a sense that the life being lived doesn't fully belong to the person living it. The dissonance doesn't always arrive early. In fact, many live for years without noticing it. But eventually, something stirs. A job begins to feel hollow. A belief system starts to chafe. A relationship dynamic, once accepted, now feels suffocating. The person begins to realize they've built a life based on what they were told to be, not what they discovered for themselves. This can trigger an identity crisis, but not in the chaotic sense often portrayed. It's subtler. A questioning of the core, a feeling of disconnection from the roles that once provided clarity, a discomfort that's hard to name. Who am I when I'm not performing? When I stop checking boxes? When I step out of the costume? I didn't realize I was wearing foreclosure often occurs in environments that discourage exploration. Cultures or families where deviation is seen as rebellion, where roles are rigid and expectations are heavy. In these spaces, conformity is survival, curiosity is a threat. And so, young people learn to commit early to beliefs, roles, futures, before they even know what else exists. But humans aren't built for permanent certainty. Growth requires elasticity. When someone forecloses their identity too soon, they miss the natural process of trial and error, rebellion and return, wandering and arriving. And over time, this rigidity becomes a trap, a life that fits only as long as it isn't questioned. What makes identity foreclosure particularly painful is that unraveling it feels like betrayal. Changing paths can feel like dishonoring the people who invested in that version of you, parents, mentors, partners. But staying locked in an outdated identity means betraying the self, the part that's quietly asking for more space, more truth, more you. Undoing foreclosure is not about abandoning responsibility or burning everything down. It's about making room, allowing new questions, exploring what was once off limits. Maybe it's a creative pursuit, a shift in beliefs, a reevaluation of gender, religion, or family roles. It doesn't mean the old identity was wrong, it means it was incomplete. This exploration can be terrifying, especially for people who've built self-worth around being sure. But uncertainty isn't failure, it's freedom. It's the sign of a mind waking up, a heart tuning in, a life getting ready to evolve. Sometimes identity isn't something found. It's something formed, deliberately, slowly, over time. And when a foreclosed identity begins to open, it's not a crisis, it's a beginning. Chronophobia, fear of time passing. When the clock becomes a countdown instead of a rhythm, chronophobia is the persistent, sometimes paralyzing fear of time moving forward. Not just the abstract idea of aging, but a visceral awareness that moments are slipping by, unrecoverable, unstoppable, and out of your control. It's the kind of fear that doesn't tick loudly, but presses inward like gravity. A constant reminder, time is passing. Time is running out. It's more than discomfort with birthdays or New Year's Eve. Chronophobia can turn ordinary experiences, watching the sunset, flipping a calendar page, hearing a clock chime, into quiet dread. A normal day starts to feel like a vanishing act. Something beautiful happens, and instead of joy, there's a stab of sadness. It's already over. For some, this fear focuses on aging, on the visible passage of time through wrinkles, transitions, milestones. For others, it's about missed opportunities, the job not taken, the love not pursued, the path not chosen. And for many, it's existential. A deep, unshakable awareness that everything is temporary and the finish line is non-negotiable. Chronophobia often surfaces during major life transitions. Graduating, turning 30, turning 60, losing someone, becoming a parent, recovering from illness. These moments mark time in sharp ways, before and after, then and now. They remind us that time moves even when we don't feel ready. It can show up as urgency, always rushing, always planning, always trying to squeeze more into each day. Productivity becomes compulsion. Leisure becomes guilt. If time is limited, the logic goes, then every second must be optimized. Every pause is wasted. Every delay feels like decay, or it can show up as paralysis, a kind of internal freeze. Why start if I'm already behind? Why try if I'll never catch up? Time becomes a wall, not a path. The very thing that should carry us forward starts to trap us. People with chronophobia often wrestle with regret and anticipation more than the present moment. The past pulls with its what-ifs. The future looms with its what-thens. Meanwhile, the now slips through their fingers unnoticed. Or worse, noticed but unheld. It can also create a fractured relationship with memory. Moments are documented obsessively, photos, videos, journals, as if evidence could anchor time. But the more it's captured, the more fragile it feels, like trying to bottle air. Technology amplifies this fear. Social media shows everyone else's timelines, milestones, achievements, youth, legacy. The clock isn't just ticking, it's performing, and everyone is watching. But at its heart, chronophobia isn't about numbers on a calendar. It's about meaning. The fear that life will pass without having mattered, that time will move, but growth won't follow, that at the end of it all, the story won't add up to anything worth telling. So, what helps? Slowing down, paradoxically. Not to deny the passage of time, but to deepen our presence in it. Time doesn't stop, but experience can stretch. A moment lived fully often feels longer than a year lived on autopilot, redefining productivity. Not as doing more, but doing what aligns. Not filling every hour, but filling some with intention. Joy, rest, connection. Slowness isn't waste. It's resistance against a culture that measures value by speed, letting go of the fantasy that everything must happen now or be lost forever. Life is not a race with one finish line. It's a landscape, wide and uneven. Growth is non-linear. Meaning doesn't run on a clock. Chronophobia softens when the mind shifts from control to curiosity, from counting time to inhabiting it, from chasing permanence to creating presence, because time will pass. But that doesn't mean it has to leave you behind. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with time is to be here, fully, while it moves.